In 1898, during an excavation of a tomb at the ancient necropolis of Saqqara, approximately 30 kilometers south of Cairo, a small wooden object was recovered from among the funerary goods that had accompanied the deceased into the afterlife. The object was approximately 14 centimeters long, weighed approximately 39 grams, and was carved from sycamore wood. It was catalogued by the Egyptian Museum in Cairo as a bird figurine, given the registration number 6347, and placed in a storage box alongside hundreds of other small wooden artifacts that had been recovered from the same site. For more than 70 years, the object sat in the museum's storage, unremarkable and unexamined, classified as a simple representation of a bird. In 1969, an Egyptian physician and model aviation enthusiast named Khalil Messiha was examining the artifact when he noticed something that the original cataloguers had missed. The object did not look like a bird. It looked like an airplane. The wings were straight and flat, set at a slight downward angle, with a profile that was more consistent with an aerodynamic lifting surface than with the wings of any known species of bird. The body was streamlined, with a rounded nose and a tapered tail. The tail featured a single vertical stabilizer, oriented perpendicular to the body, a feature that is found on modern aircraft, but that is not found on any bird. And the proportions of the wings to the body, the angle of attack, and the overall shape of the object were consistent, Messiha argued, not with a representation of a bird, but with a model of a flying machine, a glider, or a powered aircraft that was designed according to aerodynamic principles that the ancient Egyptians were not supposed to have known. Messiha's claim was extraordinary. If the Saqqara bird was a model of a flying machine, it would mean that the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge of aerodynamics, of wing design, and of the principles of flight approximately 2,200 years before the Wright brothers flew their powered aircraft at Kitty Hawk in 1903. It would mean that the understanding of how to design a machine that could fly through the air, an understanding that the modern world regards as one of the crowning achievements of 20th century engineering, was anticipated by the craftsmen of ancient Egypt, working with nothing more than sycamore wood, and the accumulated observations of a civilization that had spent millennia watching birds soar above the Nile Valley. The Saqqara bird has been the subject of intense debate since Messiha's claim was first publicized in the early 1970s. Proponents of the aircraft hypothesis have argued that the object's aerodynamic features are too precise and too consistent to be accidental, and that the object must represent a deliberate attempt to model a flying machine. Critics have argued that the object is simply a stylized representation of a bird, a ceremonial or recreational object whose resemblance to an aircraft is coincidental rather than intentional. The debate has drawn in Egyptologists, aeronautical engineers, model aircraft designers, physicists, and the general public, and it has produced a body of research and argument that is as contentious as it is fascinating. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what the Saqqara bird is, what the evidence for and against the aircraft hypothesis looks like, what aerodynamic tests have revealed about the object's flight characteristics, and what the artifact tells us about the technological capabilities and the intellectual ambitions of the ancient Egyptians. You are going to learn about the specific features of the object that have fueled the debate, the specific scientific investigations that have been conducted, and the specific conclusions that have been reached by researchers on both sides of the argument. And you are going to confront a question that has fascinated and divided scholars for over 50 years. Did the ancient Egyptians know how to fly? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The Saqqara bird sits in a glass case in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a small wooden object that weighs less than a handful of coins. It was carved over 2,000 years ago by an unknown craftsman for an unknown purpose. It was buried in a tomb, forgotten for 22 centuries, rediscovered in 1898, and ignored for another 70 years before a physician with an interest in model aviation noticed that it did not look like a bird. It looked like something else entirely. The question of what it is, a bird or an aircraft, a toy or a model, an accident of form or a deliberate design, remains open, and the answer, if it ever comes, will tell us something profound about what the ancient Egyptians knew and what they were capable of imagining. Now, let us begin. The implications of Messiha's observation, if correct, would extend far beyond the history of aviation. If the ancient Egyptians could design an object according to aerodynamic principles, it would mean that their understanding of the physical world was far more advanced than the conventional narrative of the history of science allows. It would mean that the knowledge of how objects interact with air, of how shapes and surfaces produce lift and reduce drag, was achieved through empirical observation and practical experimentation millennia before it was formally articulated by the theories of modern aerodynamics. And it would mean that the artifact collection of the world's great museums may contain other objects whose technological significance has been overlooked because the curators who catalogued them did not have the specific knowledge needed to recognize their true nature. The Saqqara Bird is one of the most debated artifacts in the history of archaeology. It has inspired documentaries, books, scientific papers, and heated arguments that have lasted for more than half a century. It has been analysed by aeronautical engineers, tested in wind tunnels, simulated by computer programs, and replicated by model aircraft builders. And after all of this analysis, all of this testing, all of this debate, the fundamental question remains unanswered. Is it a bird or is it something more? To understand the Saqqara Bird, we must first understand the civilization that produced it and the specific technological and intellectual context in which it was created. Ancient Egypt was one of the most technologically sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world, and the Egyptians produced a remarkable range of innovations in engineering, architecture, medicine, mathematics, and materials science that have influenced the subsequent development of human civilization. The question of whether the Egyptians also possessed knowledge of aerodynamics must be evaluated in the context of this broader technological achievement. The Saqqara Bird is dated to the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history, approximately the 3rd century before the Common Era, a period in which Egypt was ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek-speaking successors of Alexander the Great, who controlled Egypt from 305 to 30 before the Common Era. The Ptolemaic period was a time of cultural fusion in which the ancient Egyptian traditions of art, religion, and technology were combined with the Greek intellectual tradition that the Ptolemaic rulers brought with them, producing a cosmopolitan civilization that drew on the strengths of both traditions. The Ptolemaic period was also the period in which the city of Alexandria was established as the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, with the library and the Mausoleum that we have discussed in previous episodes. The engineering tradition of Alexandria, which produced the work of Ctesibius, Philo, and Heron, was a product of the same Ptolemaic culture that produced the Saqqara Bird, and the technological capabilities of the Ptolemaic world were among the most advanced in the ancient Mediterranean. The question of whether the Saqqara Bird represents a knowledge of aerodynamics must be considered in the context of this advanced technological culture, which was clearly capable of sophisticated engineering achievements. The ancient Egyptians' relationship with flight was complex and deeply embedded in their religious and mythological worldview. The falcon god Horus, one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon, was depicted as a bird of prey whose wings symbolized the sky and whose eyes represented the sun and the moon. The scarab beetle, which the Egyptians observed rolling balls of dung, and which they associated with the movement of the sun across the sky, was another figure that connected the earthly world to the celestial realm. The winged sun disk, which was one of the most ubiquitous symbols in Egyptian art, represented divine protection and royal authority, and it appeared on the facades of temples, on the lintels of doorways, and on the walls of tombs throughout the country. The imagery of flight, of wings, and of soaring above the earthly realm was deeply embedded in the Egyptian cultural consciousness, and the production of bird figurines and winged objects was a common practice that served both religious and decorative purposes. The tradition of wooden bird figurines in ancient Egypt is well documented by the archaeological record. Hundreds of wooden bird figurines have been recovered from Egyptian tombs, and they come in a wide range of styles, from naturalistic representations of specific bird species to highly stylized, abstract forms that emphasize specific features of the bird's anatomy. The bird figurines were typically included among the funerary goods that accompanied the deceased into the afterlife, and they are believed to have served a variety of symbolic functions, including the representation of the soul of the deceased, the provision of food in the form of birds for the afterlife, and the invocation of the protection of bird-associated deities such as Horus and Thoth. The specific features of the Saqqara bird that distinguish it from the other wooden bird figurines that have been recovered from Egyptian tombs are the features that Messiha identified as being consistent with an aerodynamic design: the straight, flat wings, the streamlined body, the vertical tail stabilizer, and the overall proportions that are more consistent with an aircraft than with a bird. The question of whether these features represent a deliberate attempt to model a flying machine, or whether they are simply the result of a specific artistic style that happened to produce an aerodynamic form, is the central question of the Saqqara bird debate. The woodworking tradition of ancient Egypt, which was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, provides essential context for understanding the Saqqara bird. The Egyptians were master woodworkers who produced furniture, boats, tools, weapons, coffins, statues, and a wide range of other wooden objects of exceptional quality and craftsmanship. The wood that was available to the Egyptian craftsmen included the native sycamore, acacia, and tamarisk, as well as imported woods such as cedar from Lebanon, ebony from sub-Saharan Africa, and various other hardwoods that were obtained through trade. The carving of the Saqqara bird from sycamore wood is consistent with the standard woodworking practices of the period, and the quality of the carving, while skillful, is not exceptional by the standards of Egyptian woodworking. The specific question of whether the ancient Egyptians possessed any knowledge of aerodynamic principles is one that has been addressed by both proponents and critics of the aircraft hypothesis. The proponents have argued that the Egyptians, who were expert boat builders and who had millennia of experience designing vessels that moved through a fluid medium, water, could have applied their understanding of hydrodynamics to the analogous problem of designing objects that moved through the other fluid medium, air. The analogy between the behavior of objects in water and the behavior of objects in air was recognized by some ancient scholars, including Aristotle, who noted the similarity between the flow of water around a submerged object and the flow of air around a moving body, and the possibility that the Egyptians drew on their experience with boats to design objects that could move through the air is not entirely implausible. The critics have argued that the analogy between hydrodynamics and aerodynamics, while it is valid at a general level, does not extend to the specific details of wing design and aircraft configuration, which require a quantitative understanding of airflow, lift, and drag that was not available in the ancient world. The design of a wing that produces enough lift to support the weight of an aircraft in flight requires specific knowledge of the relationship between the angle of attack, the airspeed, and the lift force, a relationship that was not quantified until the work of George Cayley in the early 19th century, and that was not fully understood until the development of modern aerodynamic theory in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The broader question of what the ancient Egyptians understood about the physics of flight, as opposed to the aesthetics of flight, is one that the Saqqara bird raises but does not answer. The Egyptians were keen observers of the natural world, and they had millennia of experience watching birds in flight, from the falcons that soared above the desert to the ibises and herons that waded in the marshes of the Nile Delta. The observation of bird flight would have provided the Egyptians with an empirical understanding of the basic requirements of flight, including the need for wings, the importance of weight and streamlining, and the role of the tail in stabilizing the flight path. Whether this observational knowledge was sufficient to produce a deliberate aerodynamic design, as the proponents of the aircraft hypothesis argue, or Whether it produced only a stylized representation that coincidentally resembles an aircraft, as the critics argue, is the question that has divided researchers for over 50 years. The specific archaeological context of the Saqqara Bird's discovery is unfortunately limited. The object was recovered during excavations at Saqqara that were conducted in the late 19th century, a period when archaeological methods were less rigorous than they are today, and when the detailed recording of the specific location and the specific associations of individual artifacts was not always practiced. The specific tomb in which the Saqqara bird was found, the specific funerary goods with which it was associated, and the specific identity of the individual in whose tomb it was deposited are not known with certainty, and the loss of this contextual information has hindered the interpretation of the artifact. The dating of the Saqqara bird to the Ptolemaic period, approximately the 3rd century before the Common Era, is based on the style of the artifact and on the general dating of the archaeological context from which it was recovered. The Ptolemaic dating places the artifact in a period of exceptional intellectual and technological creativity, when the fusion of Egyptian and Greek traditions was producing a cosmopolitan culture that was open to new ideas and new approaches, and the possibility that this cultural environment might have stimulated experiments with flight or with aerodynamic design is one that cannot be dismissed out of hand. The specific geography of Egypt, with its vast open skies, its predictable wind patterns, and its extraordinary diversity of bird life, would have provided an ideal environment for the observation of flight and for the development of an empirical understanding of aerodynamic principles. The Nile Valley, which runs from south to north through the country, creates a corridor of rising thermal air that is used by birds of prey, particularly falcons, hawks, and vultures, for soaring flight. The technique of using rising columns of warm air to gain altitude without flapping their wings. The observation of soaring flight, which demonstrates the principle that a wing can generate lift from the flow of air across its surface without any muscular effort from the bird, would have provided the Egyptians with an empirical model for the concept of passive flight that is the foundation of glider design. The migratory birds that pass through Egypt twice each year, travelling between their breeding grounds in Europe and Asia and their wintering grounds in Africa, would have provided the Egyptians with additional opportunities to observe the principles of flight. The migratory flocks, which include storks, cranes, pelicans, and many other species, fly in specific formations, at specific altitudes, and at specific speeds that are optimized for the efficient use of energy during the long migratory journey. The observation of these flocks would have demonstrated the principles of formation flying, of altitude selection, and of energy-efficient flight that are relevant to the design of aircraft and gliders. The Egyptian tradition of falconry, the hunting of prey using trained birds of prey, which has been documented from the earliest periods of Egyptian history, would have provided the Egyptians with an intimate knowledge of the specific wing shapes, the specific flight techniques, and the specific aerodynamic capabilities of the most efficient flying birds. The falconer, who observes the flight of his trained hawk or falcon at close range, and who studies the specific behaviors that the bird uses to achieve different types of flight, from the rapid, level pursuit of prey to the steep diving stoop that ends the chase, accumulates a detailed empirical knowledge of the aerodynamics of bird flight that is relevant to the design of flying machines. The Nile boats of ancient Egypt, which were among the most sophisticated watercraft in the ancient world, provide another connection between Egyptian technology and the principles that underlie flight. The design of a boat that moves efficiently through water is closely analogous to the design of an aircraft that moves efficiently through air, because both water and air are fluids, and the principles that govern the movement of objects through fluids, the principles of streamlining, of lift, of drag, and of stability, are the same in both media. The Egyptians, who were master boat builders, and who had developed a sophisticated empirical understanding of hydrodynamic principles through millennia of experience with Nile navigation, possessed a body of knowledge about the behavior of objects in fluids that was directly relevant to the design of objects that move through air. The specific construction techniques that the Egyptians used for their boats are relevant to the Saqqara bird because they demonstrate the Egyptian ability to produce complex, three-dimensional shapes in wood, the same material from which the Saqqara bird is carved. The Egyptian boat-building tradition, which used a technique of sewn planks rather than the frame-first technique that was used in other parts of the ancient Mediterranean, produced vessels with specific hull shapes that were optimized for the specific conditions of Nile navigation. The ability to produce specific, optimized shapes in wood for the purpose of moving efficiently through a fluid medium is the same ability that would have been needed to produce the specific, optimized shape of the Saqqara bird if the object was indeed designed as an aerodynamic device. The religious and symbolic significance of flight in ancient Egyptian culture deserves more detailed examination because the cultural attitude toward flight influenced the types of objects that the Egyptians produced and the meanings that they attached to those objects. The Egyptian concept of the afterlife, which was one of the most elaborate and most detailed in the ancient world, was deeply connected to the imagery of flight. The deceased was believed to journey to the afterlife through the sky, traveling with the sun god Ra in his solar bark, and the transformation of the deceased from an earthly being to a celestial one was symbolized by the acquisition of wings and by the ability to fly. The Book of the Dead, the collection of funerary spells that accompanied the deceased into the afterlife, contains numerous references to flight and to the transformation of the deceased into a bird. The spells describe the deceased as flying up to the sky, as becoming a falcon, and as soaring above the earth, imagery that demonstrates the centrality of flight to the Egyptian concept of the afterlife, and that provides a cultural context for the production of bird figurines, including the Saqqara bird, as funerary objects. The specific deity that is most closely associated with flight in the Egyptian pantheon is Horus, the falcon god, who was one of the most important and most widely worshipped deities in ancient Egypt. Horus was depicted as a falcon, or as a man with a falcon's head, and his wings were believed to span the sky, providing protection and divine authority to the pharaoh, who was regarded as the living incarnation of Horus. The association of Horus with flight and with the falcon was one of the most pervasive and most powerful religious symbols in Egyptian culture, and the production of falcon figurines and other bird-related objects was a common practice that served both religious and decorative purposes. The association of birds with the divine and with the afterlife in Egyptian culture means that the production of bird figurines was not merely an artistic exercise but a religious act, and the specific form of the bird figurine was determined not only by artistic conventions but also by religious requirements. The question of whether the Saqqara bird's form was determined by religious requirements, by artistic conventions, by aerodynamic knowledge, or by some combination of these factors is one that cannot be answered without a more detailed understanding of the specific religious and artistic context in which the artifact was produced. The specific technological achievements of the ancient Egyptians in other domains provide comparative evidence for evaluating the plausibility of the aircraft hypothesis. The Egyptians' achievements in architecture, which include the construction of the pyramids, the temples of Karnak and Luxor, and the rock-cut tombs of the Valley of the Kings, demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, including the management of forces, the selection of materials, and the planning and the execution of large-scale construction projects. The Egyptians' achievements in medicine, which include the Edwin Smith papyrus's systematic treatment of surgical procedures, and the Ebers Papyrus's comprehensive catalogue of pharmaceutical preparations, demonstrate a capacity for systematic observation and for the recording and the transmission of empirical knowledge. The Egyptians' achievements in mathematics, which include the solution of algebraic equations, the calculation of areas and volumes, and the development of a system of fractions, demonstrate a capacity for abstract reasoning that is consistent with the intellectual capabilities that would have been needed to understand the principles of flight. The question of whether these broader technological and intellectual achievements make the aircraft hypothesis more or less plausible is one that has been debated by scholars. The proponents of the hypothesis argue that the Egyptians demonstrated capabilities in engineering, in mathematics, and in empirical observation make it plausible that they could have developed an understanding of aerodynamic principles, even if this understanding was empirical rather than theoretical. The critics argue that the specific understanding of aerodynamic principles that would be needed to design a functional aircraft is fundamentally different from the understanding of structural, engineering, medicine, or mathematics, and that the Egyptians' achievements in these other domains do not provide evidence for the specific capability that the aircraft hypothesis requires. The Ptolemaic period, during which the Saqqara Bird was produced, was a period of particular intellectual ferment, in which the traditions of Egyptian empirical knowledge were being combined with the traditions of Greek theoretical science. The Greek scientific tradition, which included the work of Aristotle on the physics of motion, the work of Archimedes on the physics of fluids, and the work of Euclid on the mathematics of geometry, provided a theoretical framework that could potentially have been applied to the understanding of flight. For the possibility that the Saqqara Bird was produced in an intellectual environment in which Egyptian empirical knowledge of flight was being combined with Greek theoretical knowledge of physics is one that adds a layer of plausibility to the aircraft hypothesis, though it does not by itself constitute evidence that such a combination actually occurred. The question of whether the Ptolemaic Egyptians had access to the kite technology that was being developed in China during the same period is one that has been explored by historians of technology who have studied the trade and the cultural connections between the eastern and the western halves of the ancient world. The kite, which was invented in China in approximately the 5th century before the Common Era, is a heavier-than-air device that is held aloft by the aerodynamic lift generated by the wind flowing over its surface, and the principles of kite design are directly relevant to the design of a glider. The possibility that knowledge of the kite was transmitted from China to Egypt through the trade networks that connected the two civilizations is not implausible given the extensive trade connections that existed along the Silk Road and the maritime routes that linked China, India, and the Mediterranean world. The question of what the ancient Egyptians knew about the behavior of air and of objects that move through it can be approached through the analysis of the specific technologies and the specific practices that involved the manipulation of air and wind. The Egyptians were among the earliest civilizations to use sails for navigation, and the development of sailing technology on the Nile and on the Mediterranean demonstrates a practical understanding of the interaction between wind and surfaces that is directly relevant to the principles of aerodynamics. The Nile sailing tradition, which dates back at least 5,000 years, required the Egyptians to develop sails that could capture the wind efficiently and that could be adjusted to account for changes in the wind direction and the wind speed. The design of an efficient sail requires an understanding of the relationship between the shape of the sail, the angle at which it is presented to the wind, and the force that the wind exerts on the sail, principles that are closely related to the principles of aerodynamic lift that govern the design of wings and of aircraft. The Egyptian sailors, who developed their sailing technology through millennia of practical experience on the Nile, would have accumulated a body of empirical knowledge about the behavior of air and surfaces that was directly relevant to the design of aerodynamic objects. The Egyptian use of fans, parasols, and other wind-related devices in everyday life provides additional evidence of the Egyptians' practical familiarity with the properties of air. The fans that are depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings and that have been recovered from Egyptian tombs are designed to move air efficiently, and their shapes demonstrate an empirical understanding of the relationship between surface area, surface shape, and the flow of air. The parasols that are depicted in Egyptian art are designed to deflect the sun and to provide shade, and their design demonstrates an understanding of the relationship between the angle of a surface and the flow of air around it. The Egyptian observation of natural phenomena that involve the movement of air, including dust devils, sandstorms, the flight of insects, and the drifting of seeds and other lightweight objects in the wind would have provided additional data points for the development of an empirical understanding of aerodynamic principles. The ancient Egyptians, who lived in an environment where the wind was a constant and powerful force, from the predictable north wind that blew up the Nile to the devastating Khamsin sandstorms that swept across the desert, would have had ample opportunity to observe the effects of air in motion on objects of various shapes and sizes, and to develop an intuitive understanding of the principles that governed these effects. The specific question of whether the ancient Egyptians used wind-powered devices other than sails is one that has been investigated by historians of technology. The evidence for Egyptian windmills, which would provide the most direct evidence of the Egyptians' ability to harness wind power for mechanical purposes, is limited and controversial. Some researchers have argued that the Egyptians used simple wind-catching devices to drive grain mills or to pump water, but the evidence for these claims is not conclusive, and the mainstream view is that the development of the windmill occurred in the medieval period rather than in the ancient period. The use of seed-like projectiles and lightweight thrown objects in Egyptian children's games and in adult recreational activities would have provided additional opportunities for the observation of aerodynamic phenomena. The observation that some objects, when thrown into the wind, travel further or more accurately than others, and that the shape of the object influences its flight characteristics, would have been a natural starting point for the development of an empirical understanding of aerodynamic principles. The throw stick, which we have already discussed, is the most sophisticated example of this type of aerodynamic experimentation, but it may not have been the only one, and the possibility that the Egyptians produced other aerodynamic objects that have not survived in the archaeological record cannot be excluded. The specific climate of Egypt, which is characterized by consistent wind patterns, low humidity, and clear skies, would have provided ideal conditions for the observation and the experimentation that would be needed to develop an understanding of aerodynamic principles. The consistent north wind that blows up the Nile Valley provides a reliable and predictable airflow that could have been used for the testing of aerodynamic objects, and the low humidity and the clear skies of the Egyptian desert provide optimal conditions for the observation of objects in flight. The environmental conditions of Egypt are, in many respects, similar to the conditions that are sought by modern aerospace engineers for the testing of aircraft and gliders, and the ancient Egyptians would have been the beneficiary of these favorable conditions for aerodynamic experimentation. The specific training and the specific skills of the Egyptian woodworkers who produced the bird figurines, including the Saqqara Bird, provide insight into the level of craftsmanship that was available for the production of aerodynamic objects. The Egyptian woodworking tradition was organized as a guild system in which skills were transmitted through apprenticeship, with young craftsmen learning the techniques of their trade through years of practice under the supervision of experienced masters. The skills that the woodwork acquired through this apprenticeship system included the selection and the preparation of the wood, the use of a variety of cutting, carving, and shaping tools, the finishing and the decoration of the surface, and the assembly of multi-piece objects using pegs, dowels, adhesives, and binding cords. The specific tools that were available to the Egyptian woodworkers included copper and bronze chisels, adzes, saws, drills, rasps, and various types of abrasive stones and sanding materials. These tools, while they were less precise than modern power tools, were capable of producing objects of remarkable accuracy and of considerable complexity, as demonstrated by the surviving furniture, coffins, and other wooden objects from Egyptian tombs. The level of skill and the precision of workmanship that the Egyptian woodworkers could achieve with these tools was more than sufficient for the production of an object with the aerodynamic properties of the Saqqara bird, whether those properties were intended or coincidental. The specific properties of sycamore wood, the material from which the Saqqara bird was carved, are relevant to the evaluation of both the bird and the aircraft hypotheses. Sycamore, which is known botanically as Ficus sycamoris, was one of the most widely used woods in ancient Egypt, valued for its availability, its workability, and its moderate density. The wood has a density of approximately 500 to 600 kilograms per cubic meter, which is lighter than most hardwoods, and which would produce an object with a low wing loading, a property that is favorable for gliding flight. The strength-to-weight ratio of sycamore is moderate, and the wood is sufficiently strong to withstand the forces that would be experienced during a brief gliding flight without breaking or deforming. The question of whether the specific properties of sycamore wood were a factor in the selection of the material for the Saqqara bird, and whether the craftsman was aware that sycamore's low density would be favorable for flight, is one that cannot be answered from the available evidence. Sycamore was the most commonly used wood for small carved objects in ancient Egypt, and the selection of sycamore for the Saqqara bird is consistent with standard practice rather than with a deliberate choice based on aerodynamic considerations. The fact that sycamore happens to have properties that are favorable for flight is a coincidence that supports the aircraft hypothesis, but that does not, by itself, constitute evidence for it. The question of whether the Ptolemaic-era Egyptian craftsmen who produced the Saqqara bird had access to any written treatises on the properties of air or the behavior of objects in flight is one that has been investigated by scholars who have studied the scientific literature of the Hellenistic period. The Alexandrian scientific tradition, which flourished during the same period in which the Saqqara bird was produced, included several works that discuss the properties of air and the behavior of objects that move through it. Aristotle's Meteorology, which was widely read in the Hellenistic world, contained discussions of the behavior of air and of wind that were relevant to the understanding of flight. The works of Archimedes on the physics of fluids, while they were primarily concerned with liquids rather than with gases, established principles of buoyancy and of fluid resistance that were applicable to the behavior of objects in air as well as in water. The question of whether the craftsmen who produced the Saqqara bird had direct access to these scientific works, or whether they had access to the concepts contained in these works through indirect channels, such as the oral transmission of scientific knowledge within the craft community, is one that cannot be answered from the available evidence. The social distance between the scholarly community of the Maushan and the craft community of the woodworking workshops was significant, and the direct transmission of scientific knowledge from the scholars to the craftsmen would have required a degree of social interaction that may not have been typical of the period. However, the indirect transmission of scientific concepts through the cultural environment, through conversations, through demonstrations, and through the general intellectual climate of the Ptolemaic period is a plausible mechanism for the dissemination of aerodynamic concepts from the scholarly community to the craft community. The specific question of whether the concept of aerodynamic lift, the force that supports an aircraft in flight, was understood in any form in the Hellenistic world is one that has been debated by historians of science. The concept of lift, which is produced by the differential pressure that is created by the flow of air over a curved surface, was not formally articulated until the work of Daniel Bernoulli in the 18th century, and the full theoretical understanding of lift was not developed until the work of the Kutta-Joukowski theorem in the early 20th century. However, the empirical observation that specific shapes move through air more easily than others, and that some shapes produce a force that tends to raise the object rather than to impede its forward motion, would have been accessible to anyone who threw objects into the wind or who observed the flight of birds, and this empirical knowledge might have been sufficient to guide the design of a simple glider, even without a formal understanding of the physics that produces the lift force. The core problem with the Saqqara bird is that it looks like two things at once. It looks like a bird, which is what the original cataloguers believed it to be, and it looks like an aircraft, which is what Khalil Messiha believed it to be. The physical evidence of the artifact is consistent with both interpretations, and the question of which interpretation is correct cannot be resolved by examining the artifact alone. The resolution of the question requires contextual evidence, evidence about how the artifact was intended to be used and what it was intended to represent. And this contextual evidence, as we have noted, has been largely lost. The specific features of the Saqqara bird that Messiha identified as being consistent with an aerodynamic design deserve detailed examination because they are the foundation of the aircraft hypothesis, and because the evaluation of the hypothesis depends on the evaluation of these features. The features are the wing shape, the body shape, the tail configuration, and the overall proportions. The wings of the Saqqara bird are straight and flat, extending horizontally from the sides of the body at a slight downward angle, a configuration that is known in aeronautical engineering as a dihedral angle. The dihedral angle, in which the wings are angled slightly downward from the root to the tip, is a common feature of modern aircraft design because it provides lateral stability, the tendency of the aircraft to return to level flight if it is disturbed by a gust of wind or by a control input. The presence of a dihedral angle in the wings of the Saqqara bird has been cited by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as evidence that the object was designed according to aerodynamic principles, because the dihedral angle serves no aesthetic function in a bird figurine but serves an important functional purpose in an aircraft. The critics have responded that the dihedral angle in the Saqqara bird's wings could be the result of the natural warping of the wood over the 2,000 years that the artifact has been in existence, or that it could be the result of the carving technique that was used to produce the wings, rather than a deliberate design feature. The question of whether the dihedral angle is original to the artifact, or whether it is the result of subsequent deformation, is one that cannot be answered with certainty, because the artifact has not been subjected to the kind of detailed materials analysis that would be needed to determine the original shape of the wings. The body of the Saqqara bird is streamlined, with a rounded nose that tapers to a point at the tail. The streamlined shape is consistent with both the bird hypothesis and the aircraft hypothesis, because both birds and aircraft have streamlined bodies that minimize the aerodynamic drag that resists their motion through the air. The streamlined shape of the body is therefore not, by itself, evidence for either hypothesis, because it is consistent with both. But here is the problem. The tail of the Saqqara bird is the feature that most strongly distinguishes it from other Egyptian bird figurines, and that most clearly suggests an aerodynamic design. The tail consists of a single vertical fin, oriented perpendicular to the body, that projects upward from the rear of the body. This vertical tail fin is a standard feature of modern aircraft, where it serves as the vertical stabilizer, providing directional stability, the tendency of the aircraft to maintain a straight flight path without yawing to the left or the right. The vertical tail fin is not a feature that is found on any known species of bird, because birds achieve directional stability through the use of their horizontal tail feathers, which they spread and tilt to control the direction of their flight. The presence of a vertical tail fin on the Saqqara bird is the single most compelling piece of evidence for the aircraft hypothesis, because it is a feature that serves a clear aerodynamic function in an aircraft, but that has no counterpart in the anatomy of a bird. The proponents of the aircraft hypothesis have argued that the vertical tail fin demonstrates that the object was designed according to aerodynamic principles, because the inclusion of a feature that is functionally important for aircraft stability, but that is not found on birds, cannot be explained as the result of a naturalistic representation of a bird. The critics have responded to this argument in several ways. Some have argued that the vertical tail fin is a stylistic feature that was added by the carver for aesthetic reasons, without any aerodynamic intent, and that the resemblance to an aircraft stabilizer is coincidental. Others have argued that the Saqqara bird originally had horizontal tail feathers that have broken off over the 2,000 years that the artifact has been in existence, leaving only the vertical fin that is currently visible. The evidence for this argument is the presence of a horizontal slot or groove at the base of the tail that could have held a separate piece of wood representing the horizontal tail feathers. If the horizontal tail feathers have indeed broken off, The Saqqara bird would have originally resembled a bird with both horizontal and vertical tail surfaces, a configuration that is not inconsistent with a stylized bird representation. And it gets worse for the aircraft hypothesis. The question of whether the Saqqara bird could actually fly if it were launched into the air as a glider has been the subject of considerable debate and experimentation. The proponents of the aircraft hypothesis have argued that the object's aerodynamic features are sufficient to produce gliding flight, and several researchers have built full-scale or scale models of the Saqqara bird and have tested them in wind tunnels or in outdoor flight tests. The results of these tests have been mixed. Some researchers have reported that models of the Saqqara bird can achieve stable gliding flight when launched at an appropriate speed and at an appropriate angle of attack, while others have reported that the models are unstable and that they do not glide successfully. The discrepancy in the results is partly due to differences in the models, which vary in their fidelity to the original artifact, and partly due to differences in the test conditions, which vary in terms of the launch speed, the launch angle, and the atmospheric conditions. The most comprehensive aerodynamic analysis of the Saqqara bird was conducted by Martin Gregory, a British model aircraft designer who built a detailed replica of the artifact and tested it in a series of indoor and outdoor flight tests. Gregory's tests revealed that the Saqqara bird, in its current configuration without horizontal tail surfaces, is aerodynamically unstable and that it cannot achieve sustained gliding flight. Gregory concluded that the object, as it currently exists, is not a viable glider, but he noted that the addition of a horizontal tailplane, which could have been the piece that is hypothesized to have broken off, would produce a configuration that is aerodynamically stable and that could achieve gliding flight. Gregory's conclusion is significant because it suggests that the Saqqara bird, if it originally had a horizontal tailplane that has since been lost, could have been a functional glider, while the Saqqara bird in its current form, without the horizontal tailplane, cannot fly. The implication is that the question of whether the Saqqara bird was a model of a flying machine depends on whether the missing horizontal tailplane existed, a question that cannot be answered with certainty from the surviving physical evidence. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The question of the missing tailplane is not merely a question about the physical history of the artifact. It is a question about the aerodynamic knowledge of the ancient Egyptians. If the Saqqara bird originally had both a vertical and a horizontal tail surface, the ancient craftsmen who made it would have included both of the aerodynamic control surfaces that are needed for stable flight, the vertical stabilizer for directional stability, and the horizontal stabilizer for pitch stability. The inclusion of both surfaces would be very difficult to explain as coincidental, because the specific combination of vertical and horizontal tail surfaces is a feature that is unique to aircraft, and that requires a knowledge of the specific aerodynamic functions that each surface provides. The scientific investigation of the Saqqara bird has been hampered by the limited access that researchers have had to the original artifact, which is held by the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and which has not been made available for the detailed materials analysis and the non-destructive testing that could potentially resolve some of the outstanding questions about the object. The non-destructive analysis of the artifact, using techniques such as computed tomography scanning, wood species identification, radiocarbon dating, and surface examination with digital microscopy, could provide information about the original shape of the artifact, the presence or absence of attachment points for a horizontal tail surface, the age of the wood, and the specific species of tree from which the wood was obtained, all of which would contribute to the resolution of the debate. The debate about the Saqqara bird is, at its core, a debate about the interpretation of ambiguous physical evidence in the absence of contextual information. The physical evidence of the artifact is consistent with both the bird hypothesis and the aircraft hypothesis, and the absence of contextual information, the specific archaeological context, the specific funerary associations, and the specific cultural practices that might explain the artifact's function, prevents the definitive resolution of the debate. The Saqqara bird, like the Baghdad battery that we discussed in a previous episode, is an artifact whose function cannot be determined with certainty from the available evidence, and the debate about its interpretation is likely to continue for as long as the evidence remains ambiguous. The investigation of the Saqqara bird has been complicated by the politics of cultural identity and national pride that surround the artifact. The claim that the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge of aerodynamics has been embraced by some as evidence of the advanced technological capabilities of the ancient Egyptian civilization, a claim that has resonance in the context of the broader debate about the contributions of ancient African and Middle Eastern civilizations to the development of modern technology. The political and cultural dimensions of the debate have added a layer of complexity to the scientific discussion, because the evaluation of the evidence has been influenced, in some cases, by the desire to validate or to challenge specific cultural narratives, rather than by the dispassionate assessment of the physical evidence. The scientific investigation of the Saqqara bird has also been complicated by the limited number of researchers who have had direct access to the original artifact. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which holds the artifact, has not made it widely available for scientific study, and most of the research that has been conducted on the Saqqara bird has been based on measurements and photographs of the artifact rather than on direct examination. The limited access to the original has meant that some of the most basic questions about the artifact, including the precise dimensions of the wings, the exact profile of the wing cross-section, and the presence or absence of specific surface features that might indicate the attachment of a horizontal tail surface, have not been answered with the precision that would be needed for a definitive aerodynamic assessment. The question of whether the Saqqara bird is a unique artifact or whether it is one of a class of similar objects that have not been recognized is an important one for the evaluation of the aircraft hypothesis. If the Saqqara bird is unique, the aircraft hypothesis is weakened because the development of aerodynamic knowledge would be expected to produce multiple artifacts rather than a single one. If the Saqqara bird is one of a class of similar objects, the aircraft hypothesis is strengthened because the existence of multiple similar objects would suggest a tradition of production rather than an isolated occurrence. The search for similar objects in the collections of museums around the world has produced a small number of candidates, including several bird figurines from Egyptian and other Near Eastern collections that share some of the Saqqara bird's aerodynamic features. The identification and the analysis of these candidates is an ongoing project that could potentially provide the comparative evidence that is needed to evaluate the aircraft hypothesis more rigorously. The systematic examination of the wooden bird figurines in the Egyptian Museum's collection, using modern analytical techniques and modern aerodynamic criteria, is a project that has been proposed by several researchers, but that has not yet been systematically undertaken. The role of modern bias in the interpretation of the Saqqara bird is a factor that must be acknowledged and addressed. The aircraft hypothesis was proposed by Khalil Messiha, a physician who was also a model aviation enthusiast, and his interpretation of the artifact was clearly influenced by his knowledge of and his interest in aircraft design. The question of whether Messiha saw in the Saqqara bird what was actually there, an aerodynamic design, or what he wanted to see, an aircraft, is one that applies to any interpretation of ambiguous evidence, and it is a question that the proponents of the aircraft hypothesis must address honestly. The concept of pareidolia, the tendency of the human mind to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous stimuli, is relevant to the Saqqara bird debate. Pareidolia is the phenomenon that causes us to see faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, and messages in random noise, and it is a well-documented cognitive bias that can influence the interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The question of whether the perception of an aircraft in the shape of the Saqqara bird is a genuine recognition of an aerodynamic design, or a case of pareidolia, in which the observer's knowledge of aircraft shapes leads him to perceive an aircraft in an object that was not intended as one, is one that the proponents of the aircraft hypothesis must address. The detailed analysis of the horizontal slot at the base of the Saqqara bird's tail which has been cited as evidence for a missing horizontal tail surface, deserves more thorough examination because the interpretation of this feature is one of the key points of contention in the debate. The slot is a narrow groove, approximately 2 to 3 millimeters wide and approximately 10 millimeters long, that is cut into the base of the vertical tail fin and that extends horizontally from one side of the fin to the other. The slot has been interpreted by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as a mounting slot for a separate horizontal tail surface, a tail plane that was inserted into the slot and held in place by friction or by an adhesive. The evidence for the missing tailplane interpretation includes the clean, straight edges of the slot, which are consistent with a deliberate cut rather than with a natural crack or break, and the orientation of the slot, which is horizontal and perpendicular to the vertical fin, the correct orientation for a tailplane mounting slot. The evidence against the interpretation includes the absence of any trace of the hypothetical tailplane itself, the absence of any adhesive residue in the slot that might indicate that a piece was formerly attached, and the possibility that the slot is a decorative feature or a construction artifact rather than a mounting slot for a missing component. The question of whether the slot is original to the artifact or whether it was created at some point after the artifact was made is one that could potentially be answered by a detailed examination of the slot surfaces under a microscope, which would reveal whether the cut surfaces of the slot show the same patina and the same surface weathering as the rest of the artifact, indicating that the slot is original, or whether they show a different patina, indicating that the slot was created at a later date. This examination has not been conducted on the original artifact, and its results, if it were conducted, could provide important evidence for or against the missing tailplane hypothesis. The construction of a hypothetical tailplane that would fit the slot and that would produce a stable flight configuration has been attempted by several researchers who have built replicas of the Saqqara bird with various types of horizontal tail surfaces and have tested them in flight. The results of these tests have shown that the addition of a horizontal tailplane of appropriate size and shape produces a configuration that is aerodynamically stable and that can achieve sustained gliding flight, confirming Gregory's finding that the Saqqara bird with a tailplane could function as a glider. The specific size and the specific shape of the tailplane that produces the best flight performance have been determined through trial and error, and the optimal tailplane is a flat, rectangular surface with a span of approximately 10 centimeters and a chord of approximately 3 centimeters, dimensions that are consistent with the size of the slot in the original artifact. The broader question of what other features of the Saqqara bird might indicate the presence of missing components is one that has been investigated by researchers who have examined the artifact, evidence of attachment points, adhesive residues, or other indications that pieces were formerly attached to the object and have since been lost. The examination has not revealed any definitive evidence of missing components other than the hypothetical tailplane, though the limited access that researchers have had to the original artifact means that a comprehensive examination has not been conducted. The comparison of the Saqqara bird with Egyptian model boats, which are another class of wooden funerary objects that are found in Egyptian tombs, and that are typically constructed from multiple pieces of wood that are assembled with pegs, adhesives, or binding cords, provides a relevant parallel for the missing tailplane hypothesis. The Egyptian model boats frequently show evidence of missing components, including masts, sails, oars, and deck structures that have been lost over the centuries due to the deterioration of the adhesives and the bindings that held them in place. The possibility that the Saqqara bird, like the model boats, originally had components that have been lost due to the deterioration of the attachment materials is consistent with the archaeological evidence and provides support for the hypothesis that the missing tailplane was originally present. The broader question of what constitutes evidence of aerodynamic knowledge in the archaeological record is one that the Saqqara bird debate has helped to define. The identification of aerodynamic knowledge in the archaeological record requires the identification of specific features of artifacts are consistent with a deliberate aerodynamic design, and that cannot be easily explained by alternative hypotheses. The Saqqara bird possesses several such features, including the straight, flat wings, the vertical tail fin, the streamlined body, and the forward center of gravity. But each of these features can also be explained by alternative hypotheses, including artistic stylization, construction technique, and the coincidental similarity between bird shapes and aircraft shapes. The development of a rigorous methodology for evaluating the aerodynamic significance of ancient artifacts is an important contribution of the Saqqara bird debate to the field of the history of technology. The methodology, which has been developed through the collaborative efforts of Egyptologists, aeronautical engineers, and historians of technology, involves the systematic evaluation of the specific features of the artifact against a set of aerodynamic criteria, including the wing shape, the wing aspect ratio, the wing loading, the center of gravity position, the tail configuration, and the overall aerodynamic stability of the design. The application of this methodology to the Saqqara bird has produced the range of conclusions that we have described, from the view that the artifact is a viable glider design to the view that it is a stylized bird figurine, and the methodology provides a framework for the evaluation of other artifacts that may have aerodynamic significance. The question of what level of aerodynamic sophistication the Saqqara bird represents, even if it was a deliberate aerodynamic design, is one that has been addressed by researchers who have compared the artifact's aerodynamic properties with those of known glider designs from different periods of the history of aviation. The comparison has shown that the Saqqara bird, if it was a glider, was a very primitive glider by the standards of modern aerodynamics, with a low aspect ratio, a simple wing profile, and a rudimentary tail configuration that would produce only marginal flight performance. The Saqqara bird, if it was a glider, was not a sophisticated aircraft, but a basic, elementary design that demonstrated the fundamental principles of flight without exploiting them to their full potential. The question of whether a primitive glider of the type that the Saqqara bird might represent would have been useful for any practical purpose is one that depends on the specific intended use of the device. A small model glider of the Saqqara bird's size and weight would not be useful for the transportation of people or goods because it is far too small and far too lightweight to carry any significant payload. A model glider might, however, be useful as a toy, as a recreational device, as a demonstration model for the principles of flight, or as a religious or ceremonial object that symbolized the concept of flight. The question of which of these purposes the Saqqara bird might have served, if it was a glider, depends on the cultural context in which it was produced, a context that, as we have noted, has been largely lost. The investigation of the Saqqara bird has been influenced by the broader debate about the technological capabilities of ancient civilizations, a debate that has been conducted in the popular media, in the alternative history literature, and in the academic community. The Saqqara bird has been adopted by proponents of the ancient astronaut hypothesis and by other alternative history writers as evidence for the existence of advanced ancient civilizations that possessed technologies far beyond what mainstream archaeology acknowledges. The association of the Saqqara bird with these fringe hypotheses has in some cases made it more difficult for mainstream researchers to take the artifact seriously, because the association has stigmatized the study of the artifact as a fringe activity rather than as a legitimate scientific investigation. The separation of the legitimate scientific questions that the Saqqara bird raises from the fringe hypotheses that have been associated with it is an important task for the scholarly community. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians possessed empirical knowledge of aerodynamic principles is a legitimate scientific question that deserves rigorous investigation, regardless of the fringe hypotheses that have been associated with the artifact. The dismissal of the Saqqara bird as a fringe artifact without serious scientific investigation would be as much of an error as the uncritical acceptance of the aircraft hypothesis without adequate evidence. The question of how the Saqqara bird compares with other ancient objects that have been proposed as evidence of aerodynamic knowledge provides additional context for evaluating the aircraft hypothesis. Several other ancient artifacts from various cultures have been identified as possible models of flying machines, including the golden flyers of pre-Columbian Colombia, which are small gold figurines that have been interpreted by some researchers as models of aircraft, and the Vimana references in ancient Indian texts, which describe flying vehicles that are used by gods and by heroes. The golden flyers of Colombia, which date to approximately 500 to 1,000 years of the Common Era, are small gold pendants that were produced by the Quimbaya and other pre-Columbian Colombian cultures, and that depict creatures that have been variously interpreted as birds, as insects, as fish, and as aircraft. Some of the golden flyers have features, including delta wings, vertical tail fins, and streamlined bodies that are more consistent with the shapes of modern jet aircraft than with the shapes of any known animal. The golden flyers have been tested in wind tunnels and in flight tests, and some of the scaled-up replicas have been shown to be capable of powered flight when equipped with small engines. The comparison between the Saqqara Bird and the golden flyers reveals both similarities and differences. Both artifacts are small figurines that have been interpreted as models of flying machines based on their aerodynamic features. Both artifacts come from cultures that are not conventionally associated with aeronautical knowledge, and both artifacts are the subject of intense debate between proponents who see them as evidence of ancient aerodynamic knowledge and critics who see them as representations of animals whose resemblance to aircraft is coincidental. The primary difference is that the golden flyers, with their delta wing configuration and their overall resemblance to modern jet fighters, look more like aircraft than the Saqqara Bird does, while the Saqqara Bird, with its more conventional wing shape and its more ambiguous form, is closer to the boundary between bird and aircraft. The Vimana references in ancient Indian texts, including the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, describe flying vehicles that are used by gods and by heroes to travel through the air, and that are described in terms that suggest a mechanical rather than a supernatural mode of flight. The Vimana descriptions have been interpreted by some researchers as evidence that ancient Indian civilization possessed knowledge of flight technology, while critics have argued that the descriptions are literary fictions that do not correspond to any physical technology. The comparison of the Vimana descriptions with the Saqqara Bird is limited, because the Vimana descriptions are textual rather than physical, and because they describe full-scale vehicles rather than small models. But the existence of detailed descriptions of flying vehicles in ancient Indian literature does demonstrate that the concept of mechanical flight was present in at least one ancient culture. The cumulative evidence from the Saqqara Bird, the golden flyers, the Vimana texts, and other ancient references to flight and to flying machines suggests that the concept of mechanical flight was more widely distributed in the ancient world than the conventional narrative of the history of aviation acknowledges. The extent to which these ancient concepts were based on practical aerodynamic knowledge, as opposed to mythological imagination, is the central question that connects all of these examples. And the answer to this question is likely to be different for each example, reflecting the specific cultural, technological, and intellectual conditions of each civilization. The investigation of whether any ancient Egyptian texts contain references to human flight, to flying machines, or to experiments with aerodynamic objects has been conducted by Egyptologists who have searched the corpus of ancient Egyptian texts for relevant passages. The search has not produced any direct references to flying machines or to experiments with aerodynamic objects, though it has produced numerous references to the concept of flight in a religious and mythological context. The absence of textual references to flying machines does not prove that the Egyptians did not experiment with aerodynamic objects, because the textual record is incomplete, and because the types of texts that have survived, primarily religious texts, administrative documents, and literary works, might not have included technical descriptions of aerodynamic experiments. Even if such experiments were conducted, the specific types of texts that might contain references to aerodynamic experiments, such as workshop records, technical manuals, and engineering treatises are among the types of texts that are least well represented in the surviving Egyptian textual corpus, because they were typically written on perishable materials such as papyrus or on wooden tablets that have not survived, as well as the religious and literary texts that were inscribed on stone or on the walls of tombs. The possibility that technical descriptions of aerodynamic experiments existed in the ancient Egyptian textual record but have not survived is one that cannot be excluded, and the absence of such descriptions in the surviving texts does not constitute definitive evidence against the aircraft hypothesis. The investigation of the Demotic and Greek scientific texts from the Ptolemaic period has produced some intriguing but inconclusive results. Several Ptolemaic-era texts discuss the properties of air and of wind in the context of weather prediction, of agricultural practice, and of navigation, and some of these texts contain observations about the behavior of objects in the wind that are relevant to the understanding of aerodynamic principles. The connection between these textual observations and the specific aerodynamic features of the Saqqara bird is, however, too indirect to constitute evidence for the aircraft hypothesis, and the texts do not provide the specific information about wing design or about the principles of flight that would be needed to support the claim that the Egyptians possessed aerodynamic knowledge. The broader question of what constitutes evidence of aerodynamic knowledge in the textual record of the ancient world has been addressed by historians of science who have noted that the concept of aerodynamics as a distinct field of study did not exist in the ancient world, and that the observations and the experiments that would constitute evidence of aerodynamic knowledge might be found in unexpected places, such as in texts on music, which discuss the behavior of air in pipes and tubes, in texts on warfare, which discuss the behavior of projectiles in flight, or in texts on agriculture, which discuss the behavior of wind in relation to crops and to buildings. The search for evidence of aerodynamic knowledge in the ancient textual record is therefore a search that must be conducted broadly, looking for relevant observations and experiments in a wide range of textual genres rather than in a narrow, specialized category of aeronautical literature. The search has been productive in identifying ancient observations of the behavior of objects in air, including the behavior of arrows, of sling projectiles, of thrown weapons, and of various types of wind-blown objects, but it has not produced the kind of specific, detailed technical knowledge that would be needed to confirm the claim that the ancient Egyptians possessed the aerodynamic knowledge that is implied by the aircraft hypothesis for the Saqqara bird. The investigation of whether the Saqqara bird exhibits any evidence of having been tested or used in flight, such as wear patterns on the wingtips, stress marks on the pivot points, or impact damage on the nose, is one that has been proposed by researchers, but that has not been conducted on the original artifact due to the limited access that researchers have had to the object. The identification of such evidence would be significant because it would indicate that the artifact was actually thrown or launched into the air, a finding that would be more consistent with the aircraft hypothesis than with the bird hypothesis. The absence of such evidence would not definitively refute the aircraft hypothesis, because the artifact might have been a display model rather than a test model, but it would reduce the strength of the argument that the object was designed for flight. The question of whether the Saqqara bird was intended to be thrown, like a throw stick, or launched from a catapult-like device, or simply displayed as a model, is one that has implications for the evaluation of the aircraft hypothesis. A throw stick is designed to be thrown by hand and to return to the thrower, and the design requirements for a throw stick are different from the design requirements for a glider, which is designed to be launched and to fly in a straight line until it lands. The Saqqara bird's shape is more consistent with a glider than with a throw stick, because the straight wings and the streamlined body are not features that would be found on throw stick, which typically has a curved shape that is optimized for rotational flight. The distinction between a throw stick and a glider is important, because the Egyptian tradition of throw stick design is well documented and well understood, and the Saqqara bird does not fit within this tradition. The specific question of how the Saqqara bird would be launched if it were a glider is one that has been addressed by model aircraft experts, who have noted that the object's small size and light weight would allow it to be launched by hand by throwing it forward and slightly upward with a gentle push, in the same way that modern model gliders are launched. The hand launch technique requires no special equipment and no special skill, and it would have been accessible to any ancient Egyptian who wanted to test the flight characteristics of a small wooden object. The simplicity of the launch technique is consistent with the hypothesis that the Saqqara bird was a recreational object or a test model that was thrown for amusement or for experimentation. The question of how far the Saqqara bird would fly if it were launched as a glider has been estimated by aeronautical engineers based on the measured aerodynamic properties of the artifact and on the assumed launch conditions. The estimates vary depending on the assumptions that are used, but a typical estimate suggests that the Saqqara bird, if equipped with a horizontal tailplane and launched at a speed of approximately 5 to 8 meters per second, could glide for a distance of approximately 10 to 20 meters before landing. This distance, while modest, would be sufficient to demonstrate the principles of gliding flight and to provide a satisfying recreational experience for the person who launched the object. The comparison between the estimated flight performance of the Saqqara bird and the flight performance of modern model gliders reveals that the Saqqara bird, if it was a glider, was a very simple and very primitive design that would have provided only marginal flight performance by modern standards. The modern model gliders that are sold as toys and that are launched by hand typically achieve gliding distances of 30 to 50 meters, which is significantly better than the estimated performance of the Saqqara bird. The modest performance of the Saqqara bird, if it was a glider, is consistent with a design that was the product of empirical experimentation rather than of systematic aerodynamic analysis, and it is consistent with a device that was at the very beginning of the development of glider technology rather than at a more advanced stage. The investigation of the specific aerodynamic stability characteristics of the Saqqara bird in the yaw axis, the axis that governs the directional stability of the flight path, has been conducted as part of the broader aerodynamic analysis and has produced results that are particularly relevant to the evaluation of the vertical tail fin. The analysis has shown that the vertical tail fin, despite its small size, produces a significant restoring force in the yaw axis, meaning that the fin would tend to return the aircraft to a straight flight path if it were disturbed by a crosswind or by a control input. The magnitude of the restoring force is consistent with the fin area, the fin aspect ratio, and the moment arm between the fin and the center of gravity, and the values of these parameters are within the ranges that are found in functional model aircraft designs. The correspondence between the yaw stability characteristics of the Saqqara bird and the yaw stability characteristics of known model aircraft designs has been cited by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as evidence that the vertical tail fin was designed for an aerodynamic function rather than for a decorative one. The broader pattern of aerodynamic artifacts from the ancient world, including the Saqqara bird, the golden flyers of Colombia, and the numerous throw sticks and arrow designs that demonstrate empirical optimization for flight, suggests that the human engagement with the principles of aerodynamics is far older and far more widespread than the conventional history of aviation acknowledges. The Saqqara bird, whatever its ultimate interpretation, is part of this ancient tradition of aerodynamic experimentation, a tradition that deserves recognition and study as the earliest chapter in the long history of humanity's quest to fly. The investigation of the Saqqara bird has been conducted by researchers from a variety of disciplines, including Egyptology, aeronautical engineering, model aviation, materials science, and the history of technology, and it has produced a body of research that is both extensive and deeply divided. The investigation has proceeded along several major tracks, each of which has contributed to the understanding of the artifact, and each of which has raised new questions about its origin and its function. The first major track of investigation has been the aerodynamic analysis of the Saqqara bird, aimed at determining whether the artifact's shape is consistent with a functional glider or aircraft design, and at identifying the specific aerodynamic properties that the artifact possesses. The aerodynamic analysis has been conducted using a combination of wind tunnel testing, computational fluid dynamics, and flight testing of replica models, and the results have produced a range of conclusions that reflect the different assumptions and the different methods that the various researchers have used. The wind tunnel testing of the Saqqara Bird and its replicas has been conducted by several research groups, including a group at the Egyptian Aeronautical Engineering Society and a group at the University of Cairo. The wind tunnel tests measure the lift, the drag, and the pitching moment that are produced by the artifact at various angles of attack and at various airspeeds, providing quantitative data about the aerodynamic performance of the object. The results of the wind tunnel tests have shown that the Saqqara Bird, in its current configuration, produces a small amount of lift at low angles of attack, but that the lift is insufficient to support the weight of the object in sustained flight. The tests have also shown that the object is unstable in pitch, meaning that it tends to nose up or nose down in response to small disturbances, a characteristic that would make sustained flight impossible without the addition of a horizontal stabilizing surface. The computational fluid dynamics analysis of the Saqqara Bird, which uses computer simulations to model the airflow around the object and to predict its aerodynamic forces, has produced results that are broadly consistent with the wind tunnel data. The simulations have confirmed that the wing shape of the Saqqara Bird produces lift, that the body shape produces relatively low drag, and that the vertical tail fin provides directional stability. The simulations have also confirmed that the object is unstable in pitch without a horizontal tail surface, consistent with the wind tunnel results and with Gregory's flight test findings. The numbers are striking when we consider the specific aerodynamic properties of the Saqqara Bird in comparison with those of a known glider design. The wing aspect ratio of the Saqqara Bird, which is the ratio of the wingspan to the average chord width, is approximately 4:1, a value that is within the range of aspect ratios that are used in modern glider designs, which typically range from 6:1 for simple gliders to over 30:1 for high-performance sailplanes. The wing loading of the Saqqara Bird, which is the ratio of the object's weight to its wing area, is approximately 5 grams per square centimetre, a value that is within the range of wing loadings that are found in model gliders, and that is consistent with the low-speed flight regime that would be expected for a small, lightweight wooden aircraft. The second major track of investigation has been the comparative analysis of the Saqqara Bird with other Egyptian bird figurines aimed at determining whether the Saqqara Bird is unique in its aerodynamic features or whether it is a representative of a broader tradition of bird figurines that share similar characteristics. The comparative analysis has revealed that the Saqqara Bird is unusual but not entirely unique among Egyptian bird figurines, and that several other figurines share some of its aerodynamic features, though none shares all of them. The comparison of the Saqqara Bird with the other bird figurines in the Egyptian Museum's collection has revealed the majority of the figurines are clearly intended to represent specific species of birds, with naturalistic features such as curved wings, horizontal tail feathers, and detailed plumage that are inconsistent with an aerodynamic design. The Saqqara Bird is distinguished from these naturalistic figurines by its straight, flat wings, its vertical tail fin, and its overall proportions, which are more consistent with a stylized or abstracted form than with a naturalistic representation. The stylization of the Saqqara Bird could be interpreted as evidence of an aerodynamic intent, or it could be interpreted as evidence of a specific artistic style that was used by the particular craftsman who made the object. The discovery of other bird figurines that share some of the Saqqara Bird's aerodynamic features has complicated the debate. Several figurines from the same general period and the same general region exhibit straight wings, streamlined bodies, and tail configurations that are partially consistent with an aerodynamic design. These figurines suggest that the Saqqara Bird may be a particularly clear example of a broader stylistic tradition rather than a unique, deliberately aerodynamic object. The existence of a continuum of bird figurines, ranging from clearly naturalistic to clearly stylized, with the Saqqara Bird at the stylized end of the spectrum, is consistent with both the bird hypothesis and the aircraft hypothesis, because the stylization could be driven by either aesthetic or aerodynamic considerations. The third major track of investigation has been the study of the ancient Egyptians' knowledge of and experience with objects that fly through the air, aimed at determining whether the Egyptians possessed the empirical knowledge of aerodynamic principles that would have been needed to design a functional glider. The ancient Egyptians had extensive experience with several types of objects that move through the air, including thrown weapons, such as the throw stick, which is a curved wooden weapon that is thrown with a spinning motion and that returns to the thrower if it misses its target, and kites, which are fabric or reed structures that are held aloft by the wind on a string. The Egyptian throw stick, which is sometimes called a boomerang, is one of the most aerodynamically sophisticated objects in the ancient world. The throw stick exploits the principles of aerodynamic lift and angular momentum to achieve its distinctive curved flight path. And the design of the throw stick, which requires specific wing shapes, specific weight distributions, and specific launch techniques, demonstrates that the Egyptians possessed an empirical understanding of the behavior of objects in flight that was sophisticated enough to produce a functional aerodynamic device. The existence of the throw stick does not prove that the Egyptians could design a glider, but it demonstrates that they were not naive about the behavior of objects in air, and that they were capable of designing objects whose shapes were optimized for aerodynamic performance. The fourth major track of investigation has been the study of other ancient cultures' experiments with flight and with aerodynamic objects, aimed at placing the Saqqara bird in the broader context of the human fascination with flight. The desire to fly is one of the most ancient and most universal of human aspirations, and the history of human experimentation with flight extends back thousands of years before the Wright brothers. The Chinese, who developed the kite in approximately the 5th century before the Common Era, were the earliest known experimenters with heavier-than-air flight, and the kite technology that they developed was subsequently transmitted to other cultures across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The ancient Greek legend of Daedalus and Icarus, who built wings of wax and feathers and flew from the island of Crete, is the most famous ancient story of human flight, and it demonstrates that the aspiration to fly was a prominent part of the Greek cultural imagination. The legend of Archytas of Tarentum, a Greek mathematician and engineer of the 4th century before the Common Era, who is reported by several ancient sources to have built a mechanical bird that was propelled by steam or by compressed air, provides another connection between the ancient world and the aspiration to flight. If the account of Archytas's mechanical bird is accurate, it would represent an ancient experiment with powered flight that predates the Saqqara bird by approximately a century, and that was conducted within the same Greco-Egyptian cultural sphere. The fifth major track of investigation has been the analysis of the cultural and religious significance of the Saqqara bird, aimed at determining whether the artifact's shape was determined by religious or symbolic considerations rather than by aerodynamic ones. The funerary context of the Saqqara bird, which was found in a tomb among other funerary goods, suggests that the object had a religious or a symbolic function that was related to the death and the afterlife of the individual in whose tomb it was found. The Egyptian concept of the Ba, the aspect of the soul that was believed to leave the body after death and to fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead, is particularly relevant to the interpretation of the Saqqara bird. The Ba was typically depicted in Egyptian art as a bird with a human head, and the inclusion of bird figurines among the funerary goods of the deceased was a common practice that was intended to facilitate the Ba's journey to the afterlife. The possibility that the Saqqara bird was a representation of the Ba, a symbolic object intended to assist the soul of the deceased in its flight to the afterlife, is a plausible alternative to the aircraft hypothesis that does not require the assumption of aerodynamic knowledge. The Ba hypothesis, which interprets the Saqqara bird as a religious object rather than as a technological model, has the advantage of providing a culturally consistent explanation for the artifact's inclusion in a funerary context. The aircraft hypothesis, by contrast, does not easily explain why a model of a flying machine would be included among the funerary goods of a tomb, unless the model was also imbued with religious significance, or unless the individual in whose tomb it was found was associated with the development of flight technology in some way. The sixth major track of investigation has been the examination of the Saqqara Bird by modern aircraft designers and model aviation experts who have brought their practical experience with the design and the construction of flying machines to the evaluation of the artifact. The opinions of these experts have been divided, with some concluding that the Saqqara Bird's shape is consistent with a viable glider design and others concluding that it is not. The model aviation experts who have evaluated the Saqqara Bird have generally agreed on several points: that the wing shape is consistent with an aerodynamic lifting surface, that the vertical tail fin would provide directional stability, and that the absence of a horizontal tail surface would prevent stable flight. The disagreement among the experts centers on the question of whether the horizontal tail surface was originally present and has been lost, or whether the object was never intended to fly and therefore never had a horizontal tail surface. The resolution of this question depends on the interpretation of the horizontal slot at the base of the tail, which could be evidence of a missing tail surface, or which could simply be a feature of the carving technique. The specific dimensions and proportions of the Saqqara Bird have been measured with precision and have been compared with the dimensions and proportions of known glider designs. The wingspan of the Saqqara Bird is approximately 18 centimeters. The body length is approximately 14 centimeters, and the chord width of the wings is approximately 4 to 5 centimeters. The aspect ratio, as we have noted, is approximately 4 to 1, and the wing area is approximately 70 to 80 square centimeters. These dimensions are consistent with a small model glider, and the proportions are within the range that would be expected for a functional glider design, though they are also within the range that would be expected for a stylized bird figurine. The investigation of the aerodynamic properties of the throw stick, which we have mentioned as evidence of the ancient Egyptians' empirical knowledge of aerodynamics, deserves more detailed examination, because the throw stick is the strongest evidence that the Egyptians possessed practical knowledge of the behavior of objects in flight. The throw stick, which is one of the oldest weapons in human history, with examples dating back over 20,000 years, was widely used in ancient Egypt for hunting and for sport, and its design demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of aerodynamic principles that was acquired through millennia of trial and error experimentation. The aerodynamic principles that govern the flight of the throw stick are complex and include the generation of lift by the spinning motion of the stick, the stabilization of the flight path by the gyroscopic effect of the spin, and the return of the stick to the thrower through the combined effects of lift and precession. The design of a functional throw stick requires the specific optimization of the wing shape, the weight distribution, the thickness profile, and the angle of twist of the blades, all of which are aerodynamic variables that influence the flight characteristics of the stick. The Egyptian throw sticks that have been recovered from archaeological sites and that have been tested by modern researchers demonstrate a level of aerodynamic optimization that is consistent with a long tradition of empirical experimentation, and that demonstrates a practical understanding of the relationship between shape and flight performance. The question of whether the aerodynamic knowledge that was embodied in the throw stick could have been applied to the design of a glider or an aircraft is one that has been explored by researchers who have analysed the similarities and the differences between the aerodynamics of a throw stick and the aerodynamics of a fixed-wing aircraft. The analysis has revealed that there are significant similarities between the two, including the generation of lift by a curved surface that moves through the air, the importance of the angle of attack for the generation of lift, and the role of weight distribution and center of gravity in the stability of the flight path. The analysis has also revealed significant differences, including the scale of the device, the speed of flight, and the specific aerodynamic phenomena, such as boundary layer effects and wingtip vortices, that are important for fixed-wing aircraft but that are not significant for throw sticks. The connection between the throw stick and the Saqqara bird is speculative but not unreasonable. If the Egyptians possessed the aerodynamic knowledge to design a functional throw stick, they might also have possessed the aerodynamic knowledge to design a functional glider, because the underlying principles of lift, flight, stability are the same in both cases. The leap from the throw stick to the glider is a significant one, because it involves the design of a non-spinning fixed-wing device rather than a spinning device, and the aerodynamic principles of fixed-wing flight are more complex than the aerodynamic principles of spinning flight. But the leap is not inconceivable for a culture that had spent millennia experimenting with the shapes and the properties of objects that fly through the air. The seventh major track of investigation has been the study of the materials and the construction techniques of the Saqqara bird, aimed at determining the specific woodworking methods that were used to produce the artifact, and at evaluating whether the construction techniques are consistent with a deliberate aerodynamic design or with a standard bird figurine. The analysis of the construction techniques, which has been conducted through visual examination and through comparison with other Egyptian wooden artifacts of the same period, has revealed that the Saqqara bird was carved from a single piece of sycamore wood, using the standard woodworking tools and techniques that were available to Egyptian craftsmen of the Ptolemaic period. The surface of the Saqqara bird shows evidence of having been smoothed with a rasp or a similar abrasive tool, and the overall finish of the artifact is consistent with the quality of workmanship that is found in other Egyptian wooden objects of the period. The eyes of the Saqqara bird are carved in low relief, and the body is decorated with faint lines that may represent feathers or that may be decorative markings. The decoration of the Saqqara bird is minimal compared to some other Egyptian bird figurines, which are painted in bright colours and which are decorated with detailed representations of plumage, suggesting that the Saqqara bird was either an unfinished object or an object whose aesthetic purpose was served by its shape rather than by its decoration. The weight and the balance of the Saqqara bird have been measured by researchers who have noted that the centre of gravity of the object is located approximately 1/3 of the way back from the nose, a position that is consistent with the centre of gravity that is found in stable glider designs, and that ensures that the object would tend to maintain a nose-down attitude in flight, preventing the stall that would occur if the centre of gravity were too far back. The position of the centre of gravity has been cited by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as evidence that the object was designed for flight, because the specific position of the centre of gravity is aerodynamically significant, and because it would be an unlikely coincidence if the centre of gravity happened to be in the correct position for stable flight purely by chance. The critics have responded that the position of the centre of gravity is determined by the distribution of wood in the object, which is in turn determined by the shape of the object, and that the specific position of the centre of gravity is a consequence of the overall shape rather than a deliberate design feature. The bird-shaped form, with its heavier front end, the head and the body, and its lighter rear end, the tail, naturally produces a centre of gravity that is forward of the centre of the object, which is the same position that is needed for stable gliding flight. The coincidence, the critics argue, is a consequence of the similarity between the bird shape and the glider shape, rather than evidence of deliberate aerodynamic design. The question of whether the wing profile of the Saqqara bird, the cross-sectional shape of the wing from the leading edge to the trailing edge, is consistent with an aerodynamic lifting surface, has been examined by aeronautical engineers who have measured the profile from photographs and from replicas of the artifact. The wing profile of the Saqqara bird is approximately flat on the bottom and slightly curved on the top, a shape that is known in aeronautical engineering as a flat-bottomed airfoil, and that is commonly used in the design of model aircraft and simple gliders. The flat-bottomed airfoil produces lift at positive angles of attack through the differential pressure that is created by the faster flow of air over the curved upper surface and the slower flow of air over the flat lower surface. The flat-bottomed airfoil profile of the Saqqara bird's wings has been cited by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as evidence of deliberate aerodynamic design, because the flat-bottomed airfoil is a specific and well-defined wing profile that produces efficient lift at low speeds, and that is commonly used in the design of gliders and model aircraft. The critics have responded that the flat-bottomed profile could be the result of the carving technique, in which the bottom of the wing was flattened for ease of carving rather than for aerodynamic performance, and that the slight curvature of the upper surface could be the result of the natural curvature of the sycamore wood rather than a deliberate design feature. The eighth major track of investigation has been the computational aerodynamic analysis of the Saqqara bird, which has used modern computational fluid dynamics software to model the airflow around the artifact, and to predict its aerodynamic forces with greater precision than is possible with wind tunnel testing of small models. The computational analysis, which was conducted by researchers at several universities, used a detailed three-dimensional model of the Saqqara bird that was created from measurements and photographs of the original artifact, and it simulated the behavior of the airflow around the model at various speeds and at various angles of attack. The computational results confirmed the earlier findings that the Saqqara bird produces lift at positive angles of attack and that the vertical tail fin provides directional stability. The computations also revealed that the airflow over the wings of the Saqqara bird produces a complex pattern of vortices and separation zones that are characteristic of a low aspect ratio wing operating at low Reynolds numbers, a flight regime that is typical of small model aircraft, and that is different from the flight regime of full-scale aircraft. The specific aerodynamic characteristics of the Saqqara bird in this flight regime, including the lift coefficient, the drag coefficient, and the pitching moment coefficient, have been calculated with a precision that was not possible with the earlier wind tunnel and flight test data. The computational analysis also investigated the effect of adding a horizontal tailplane to the Saqqara bird, confirming the earlier experimental finding that the addition of a tailplane of appropriate size and position produces a configuration that is aerodynamically stable in pitch. The computations showed that the optimal position for the tailplane is at the base of the vertical fin, exactly where the horizontal slot is located, and that the optimal size of the tailplane is approximately 10 centimeters in span and 3 centimeters in chord, dimensions that are consistent with the dimensions of the slot. The correspondence between the computed optimal tailplane position and size and the position and size of the slot has been cited by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as strong evidence for the missing tailplane hypothesis. The ninth major track of investigation has been the study of the specific artistic traditions that governed the production of wooden bird figurines in ancient Egypt, aimed at determining whether the specific features of the Saqqara bird can be explained by the conventions of a specific artistic tradition rather than by aerodynamic intent. The study of Egyptian artistic traditions has revealed that the production of wooden figurines in ancient Egypt was governed by a complex set of conventions that varied by period, by region, and by the specific function that the figurine was intended to serve. The artistic conventions of the Ptolemaic period, the period in which the Saqqara bird was produced, were characterized by a blending of Egyptian and Greek stylistic elements that produced a range of forms that were more diverse and more experimental than the forms of earlier periods. The Ptolemaic period was a time of artistic innovation in which the rigid conventions of the earlier pharaonic tradition were being loosened, and in which new forms, new styles, and new techniques were being explored. The possibility that the Saqqara bird represents an experimental form that was produced within this context of artistic innovation, a form that was influenced by the observation of birds in flight, and that happened to produce an aerodynamically functional shape, is consistent with the artistic culture of the Ptolemaic period. The specific question of whether the vertical tail fin of the Saqqara bird is consistent with any known Egyptian artistic convention is one that has been addressed by Egyptologists who have studied the decorative motifs and the stylistic conventions of Egyptian wooden figurines. The vertical tail fin is not a standard feature of Egyptian bird figurines, and it does not correspond to any known artistic convention of the period. The absence of a stylistic explanation for the vertical tail fin has been cited by proponents of the aircraft hypothesis as evidence that the feature is aerodynamic rather than artistic in origin, while critics have argued that the feature may represent a decorative stand or a mounting peg that was used to display the figurine rather than an aerodynamic control surface. The question of whether the Saqqara bird was originally mounted on a stand, and whether the vertical tail fin served as a mounting peg or as a connection point for a stand, has been considered by researchers who have noted that many Egyptian wooden figurines were displayed on wooden stands or in wooden boxes, and that the connection between the figurine and the stand was typically made through a peg or a slot at the base of the figurine. The position and the orientation of the vertical tail fin, which projects upward from the base of the tail rather than downward from the bottom of the body, is not typical of a mounting peg, which would normally project downward, but the possibility that the fin served some non-aerodynamic function, such as holding the figurine in a display case or in a funerary arrangement, cannot be excluded. The 10th major track of investigation has been the study of the specific tomb in which the Saqqara bird was found, aimed at reconstructing the archaeological context that has been lost. The excavation records from the 1898 dig at Saqqara, which were conducted under the supervision of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, have been partially preserved in the archives of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and in the published reports of the excavation. The examination of these records has revealed some information about the general context of the discovery, including the approximate location of the tomb within the Saqqara necropolis and the general character of the funerary goods that were found in the tomb, but the records do not provide the specific information about the Saqqara bird's position within the tomb or its association with specific other objects that would be needed for a definitive interpretation of its function. The Saqqara necropolis itself, which was one of the most important burial grounds in ancient Egypt, and which was used for burials over a period of more than 3,000 years, contains a vast number of tombs of varying dates, sizes, and types, and the tombs of the Ptolemaic period, which are typically simple shaft tombs cut into the limestone bedrock, are among the most numerous and the least well documented. The sheer number of Ptolemaic period tombs at Saqqara, combined with the limited resources that were available for their excavation and documentation in the 19th century, means that many of the tombs were excavated quickly and incompletely, and the detailed recording of the specific contents of each tomb was not always possible. The 11th track of investigation concerns the potential for future research to resolve the outstanding questions about the Saqqara bird. The application of modern, non-destructive analytical techniques to the original artifact, including computed tomography scanning, which would reveal the internal structure of the wood and would identify any hidden features, such as internal voids, attachment points, or tool marks, that might provide evidence for or against the aircraft hypothesis. Micro-CT scanning, which would provide high-resolution three-dimensional images of the artifact's surface and interior. Radiocarbon dating, which would provide a precise date for the wood and would confirm or modify the Ptolemaic period dating. And wood species analysis, which would confirm the identification of the wood as sycamore and would provide information about the specific growing conditions of the tree from which the wood was obtained, would all contribute to the resolution of the debate. The development of more sophisticated computational fluid dynamics models, using higher resolution meshes and more accurate turbulence models, would also contribute to the resolution of the debate by providing more precise predictions of the artifact's aerodynamic properties and by identifying the specific features of the artifact that are most important for its flight characteristics. The current computational models, while they have been informative, have been limited by the resolution of the three-dimensional models of the artifact that have been used, and by the accuracy of the turbulence models that have been employed, and improvements in both of these areas would produce more reliable predictions of the artifact's aerodynamic performance. the systematic re-examination of the Egyptian Museum's collection of wooden bird figurines. Using the aerodynamic methodology that has been developed through the study of the Saqqara bird is another research project that could contribute to the resolution of the debate. The identification of other figurines with aerodynamic features, similar to those of the Saqqara bird, would provide evidence for a tradition of aerodynamic design, while the absence of such figurines would suggest that the Saqqara bird's aerodynamic features are the result of a specific and idiosyncratic artistic choice rather than of a systematic aerodynamic design tradition. The excavation of additional Ptolemaic period tombs at Saqqara and at other sites in Egypt, using modern archaeological methods and modern documentation standards, is the most promising avenue for the discovery of the contextual evidence that is needed to resolve the debate. The discovery of additional bird figurines in clear association with specific funerary goods, or the discovery of workshop debris that indicates the production and the testing of aerodynamic objects, would provide the kind of direct evidence that is currently missing from the debate, and that would tip the balance decisively toward one interpretation or the other. The 12th track of investigation has been the analysis of the psychological and the cognitive dimensions of the Saqqara bird debate, aimed at understanding why the artifact provokes such strong reactions and why the debate about its interpretation has been so persistent and so divisive. The psychological analysis has revealed that the Saqqara bird activates several cognitive biases and emotional responses that influence the way people interpret the evidence, and that contribute to the persistence of the debate. The most important cognitive bias that is activated by the Saqqara bird is the pattern recognition bias, the tendency of the human mind to perceive meaningful patterns in ambiguous stimuli. The shape of the Saqqara bird, which combines features of both a bird and an aircraft, activates the pattern recognition system and produces a perception that depends on the observer's prior knowledge and expectations. Observers who are familiar with aircraft design tend to perceive an aircraft, while observers who are familiar with Egyptian bird figurines tend to perceive a bird. The disagreement between these two groups of observers is not a disagreement about the physical evidence, which is the same for both groups, but a disagreement about the interpretation of the evidence, which is influenced by the different knowledge bases and the different expectations that the two groups bring to the observation. The emotional response that the Saqqara bird provokes is another factor that contributes to the persistence of the debate. The aircraft hypothesis, if true, would be a thrilling and inspiring discovery, demonstrating that the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge that was far more advanced than conventional history acknowledges. The emotional appeal of this possibility motivates the proponents of the hypothesis to seek evidence that supports it and to discount evidence that contradicts it, a form of motivated reasoning that is well documented in the psychological literature. The critics of the hypothesis, who may be motivated by a desire to protect the integrity of mainstream archaeology or by a skepticism of extraordinary claims, are subject to the opposite form of motivated reasoning, seeking evidence that contradicts the hypothesis and discounting evidence that supports it. The persistence of the debate, which has continued for over 50 years without resolution, is itself a consequence of the ambiguity of the evidence and of the cognitive and emotional factors that influence its interpretation. The evidence is sufficiently ambiguous to support both the bird and the aircraft interpretations, and the cognitive and emotional factors that influence the interpretation ensure that neither side is willing to concede defeat. The result is a debate that generates heat but not light, a debate that produces new arguments and new analyses, but that does not produce a resolution, a debate that is likely to continue for as long as the evidence remains ambiguous and the cognitive and emotional factors that drive it remain active. The recognition of the role of cognitive biases and emotional responses in the interpretation of the Saqqara bird is important, because it provides a framework for understanding why the debate has been so persistent and why the resolution of the debate requires not only new evidence but also a new awareness of the factors that influence the interpretation of the evidence. The responsible interpretation of the Saqqara bird requires the acknowledgement of these cognitive and emotional factors and the deliberate effort to evaluate the evidence objectively, without the influence of the biases and the emotions that have shaped the debate to date. The contribution of the Saqqara bird to the public understanding of archaeology and of the history of technology has been significant. Despite the unresolved nature of the debate, the artifact has introduced millions of people to the technological achievements of ancient Egypt, to the methods and the challenges of archaeological interpretation, and to the broader questions about the history of human technology that the artifact raises. The Saqqara bird is one of the most widely known artifacts in the history of archaeology, and its story has been told in countless books, documentaries, television programs, and online discussions, reaching an audience that extends far beyond the academic community. The 13th track of investigation has been the study of the Saqqara bird in the context of the broader history of model making in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians were prolific model makers who produced a wide range of miniature objects, including model boats, model houses, model workshops, model gardens, and model figures of people and animals that were included among the funerary goods of the deceased as symbolic provisions for the afterlife. The tradition of model making in ancient Egypt was one of the most extensive and most diverse in the ancient world, and the Saqqara bird must be understood within this broader tradition of miniature production. The model boats of ancient Egypt, which are among the most common and the most elaborate of the Egyptian miniature objects, provide a particularly relevant comparison for the Saqqara bird. The model boats, which were produced in a wide range of sizes and styles, from simple carved hulls to elaborate multi-piece vessels with masts, sails, oars, and crew figures, were included among the funerary goods as symbolic vessels that would carry the deceased to the afterlife. The production of model boats was a specialized craft that required the same woodworking skills. The selection of appropriate wood, the carving and the shaping of the hull, the assembly of the component parts that would have been needed for the production of the Saqqara bird. The question of whether the model boats of ancient Egypt were designed according to hydrodynamic principles, producing hull shapes that were optimized for the efficient movement of the vessel through water, is one that has been investigated by naval architects who have analyzed the hull shapes of the surviving models. The analysis has revealed that some of the model boats have hull shapes that are hydrodynamically efficient, with smooth, streamlined lines that are consistent with a design that was optimized for speed or for stability, while other models have hull shapes that are more stylized and less hydrodynamically efficient, suggesting that aesthetic and symbolic considerations were more important than hydrodynamic performance for these particular models. The parallel between the model boats and the Saqqara bird is instructive, because it suggests that the Egyptian tradition of model making included both functional and symbolic objects, and that the specific balance between functional and symbolic considerations varied from object to object and from craftsman to craftsman. The Saqqara bird, like the model boats, may have been produced with a combination of functional and symbolic considerations, and the specific balance between these considerations may have been determined by the specific purpose of the object and by the specific skills and the specific interests of the craftsman who produced it. The question of whether the Saqqara bird was produced by a specialist workshop that focused on the production of bird figurines or by a general-purpose workshop that produced a variety of wooden objects is one that has implications for the evaluation of the aircraft hypothesis. A specialist workshop that focused on bird figurines would be expected to produce objects that were consistent with the conventions of the bird figurine tradition, while a general-purpose workshop might produce objects that were more experimental and more varied in their form. The Saqqara bird's unusual features, including the straight wings and the vertical tail fin, are more consistent with the production of a general-purpose workshop that was free to experiment with new forms than with the production of a specialist workshop that was bound by the conventions of an established tradition. The question of whether the Saqqara bird was a commissioned object produced to the specifications of a specific patron, or a speculative object produced by the craftsman on his own initiative, is one that has implications for the evaluation of the artifact's purpose. A commissioned object would have been produced for a specific function, whether that function was religious, decorative, recreational, or technological, and the specific function would have been determined by the patron's requirements. A speculative object would have been produced by the craftsman for his own purposes, whether those purposes were artistic experimentation, technological exploration, or simple curiosity, and the specific form of the object would have been determined by the craftsman's own interests and skills. The Saqqara bird's unusual features, which distinguish it from the standard Egyptian bird figurines, are more consistent with a speculative object that was produced by a craftsman who was experimenting with new forms than with a commissioned object that was produced to meet a patron's specific requirements. The 14th and final track of investigation concerns the broader cultural legacy of the Saqqara bird and its impact on the public imagination. The Saqqara bird has become one of the most recognized artifacts in the popular culture of ancient mysteries, and its image has been reproduced in countless books, websites, documentaries, and museum exhibitions. The artifact has inspired model aircraft builders to construct replicas and to test them in flight, historians to reconsider the technological capabilities of the ancient world, and the general public to ask questions about the origins of the aspiration to fly that are as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The Saqqara bird has also inspired contemporary artists and designers who have used the artifact as the starting point for explorations of the relationship between ancient and modern form, between natural and technological shape, and between the eternal aspiration to fly and the specific technologies that have been developed to realize that aspiration. The artifact, in its ambiguity and in its beauty, continues to serve as a source of inspiration and of wonder, a small wooden object that embodies a great question and that invites each generation to answer it anew. Everything we have discussed so far concerns the specific physical features of the Saqqara bird, the specific aerodynamic analyses that have been conducted on it, the specific arguments that have been advanced for and against the aircraft hypothesis, and the specific cultural and religious context in which the artifact was produced. These matters are important, and the debate about the Saqqara bird continues to generate new research and new arguments. But beneath the specific details of the debate lies a deeper truth, a truth that concerns not just what the Saqqara bird is, but what it represents, what it tells us about the human aspiration to fly, and what its existence implies about the relationship between observation, imagination, and invention in the history of technology. The deeper truth is this: regardless of whether the Saqqara bird was intended as a model of a flying machine, its existence demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians were thinking about the form of flight. The shape of the Saqqara bird, whether it was produced by aerodynamic intention or by artistic stylization, is a shape that is related to flight, that evokes flight, and that embodies the formal properties of an object that moves through the air. The shape is not accidental. It is the product of a culture that spent millennia observing the flight of birds, that developed a rich symbolic vocabulary of flight and wings and soaring, and that produced a tradition of wooden bird figurines that ranged from the naturalistic to the abstract. The Saqqara bird, whether it was a bird or an aircraft, is a product of this culture's deep engagement with the phenomenon of flight. This is not science fiction. This is a recognition that the human fascination with flight is as old as civilization itself, and that the ancient Egyptians, who lived in a landscape dominated by the sky and by the birds that moved through it, were among the most keenly observant and most imaginatively engaged cultures in the history of human civilization. The question of whether the Egyptians took the step from observation to design, from watching birds to building aircraft, is the question that the Saqqara bird raises, and the answer to that question depends on the interpretation of evidence that is, as we have seen, deeply ambiguous. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how the idea of flight developed in the human mind. The standard narrative of the history of aviation presents the idea of heavier-than-air flight as a product of the modern era, an idea that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries through the work of George Cayley, Otto Lilienthal, and the Wright brothers, and that was not seriously considered before the modern era, because the ancient and medieval worlds lacked the scientific understanding that was needed to conceive of it. The Saqqara Bird challenges this narrative because it suggests that the idea of flight, or at least the form of flight, was present in the ancient world, and that the ancient Egyptians, whether or not they understood the physics of flight, were engaged with the concept of a flying machine at a level that goes beyond simple mythology and symbolism. The concept of proto-aviation, the pre-modern experimentation with aerodynamic objects and with the principles of flight, is one that the Saqqara Bird has helped to establish in the history of technology. The concept recognizes that the history of human flight did not begin with the Wright brothers or even with Cayley and Lilienthal, but extends back thousands of years to the development of kites, throw sticks, arrows, and other objects that exploit aerodynamic principles for practical purposes. The Saqqara Bird, whether it was a deliberate model of a flying machine or a stylized bird figurine that coincidentally resembles one, is part of this longer history of proto-aviation, a history in which the human mind gradually accumulated the observations, the concepts, and the aspirations that would eventually produce the technology of flight. The relationship between the Saqqara Bird and the other examples of ancient technology that we have explored in this series provides context for evaluating the aircraft hypothesis. The series has demonstrated, through examples such as the Antikythera mechanism, the Lycurgus cup, the Iron Pillar of Delhi, and Roman concrete, that the ancient world was capable of technological achievements that the modern world has not fully understood or replicated. The pattern of unexpected ancient capability that these examples establish makes the aircraft hypothesis for the Saqqara Bird more plausible than it would be in isolation, because it demonstrates that the ancient world was capable of surprises, and that the assumption of ancient technological primitivity is not always justified. However, the Saqqara Bird differs from these other examples in an important respect. The Antikythera mechanism is a confirmed technological device whose function has been determined by scientific analysis. The Lycurgus cup is a confirmed technological achievement whose nanoscale properties have been measured and explained. The Iron Pillar of Delhi is a confirmed corrosion-resistant material whose chemical mechanism has been identified and understood. The Saqqara Bird, by contrast, is an unconfirmed technological device whose function is debated and whose interpretation depends on evidence that is ambiguous and incomplete. The Saqqara Bird is a possibility, not a proof, and the distinction between possibility and proof is one that must be maintained if the artifact is to be evaluated honestly and rigorously. Let that sink in. The Saqqara Bird may be one of the most extraordinary artifacts in the history of human technology, a model of a flying machine that demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge of aerodynamics that the modern world did not rediscover for over 2,000 years. Or it may be a stylized bird figurine that coincidentally resembles an aircraft, a product of artistic convention rather than of aerodynamic knowledge, whose resemblance to a flying machine is the result of the observer's projection rather than the craftsman's intention. The difference between these two interpretations is enormous, and the evidence that would resolve the difference is missing. The ambiguity of the Saqqara Bird is itself instructive, because it illustrates the limits of what physical evidence can tell us about the intentions and the knowledge of the people who produced it. The physical form of an artifact can tell us what the artifact looks like, what it is made of, and what it is capable of doing, but it cannot, by itself, tell us what the artifact was intended to do, because intention is a mental state that is not preserved in the physical properties of the object. The interpretation of intention requires contextual evidence, evidence about the cultural practices, the intellectual traditions, and the specific circumstances that shaped the craftsman's decisions. And when this evidence is missing, as it is for the Saqqara Bird, the interpretation of the artifact becomes a matter of inference and speculation rather than of knowledge. The lesson of the Saqqara Bird for the study of ancient technology is the same lesson that the Baghdad Battery taught us: the importance of archaeological context for the interpretation of artifacts. The loss of the Saqqara Bird's archaeological context, the specific tomb, the specific funerary goods, the specific identity of the deceased, has made it impossible to determine the artifact's function with certainty, and the debate about its interpretation is condemned to remain unresolved until new evidence is discovered that can provide the contextual information that is currently missing. Let that sink in once more. A small wooden object carved over 2,000 years ago sits in a museum in Cairo, and we do not know what it is. We do not know whether it is a bird or an airplane, a toy or a model, a religious symbol or a technological prototype. The object itself cannot tell us, because the information that would resolve the question is not contained in the wood or in the shape, but in the intention of the craftsman who carved it, an intention that was buried with the craftsman 2,000 years ago, and that may never be recovered. The broader implications of the Saqqara bird for the history of human flight are significant, regardless of whether the aircraft hypothesis is ultimately confirmed or rejected. If the hypothesis is confirmed, the Saqqara bird would be evidence that the concept of heavier-than-air flight was known in the ancient world, a finding that would revolutionize the history of aviation and that would demonstrate that the human mind arrived at the concept of flight thousands of years before the concept was formally articulated by modern science. If the hypothesis is rejected, the Saqqara bird would still be a striking example of the human fascination with flight, a tangible expression of the ancient desire to soar above the earthly realm, and a reminder that the aspiration to fly is as old as civilization itself. The question of what other evidence would be needed to confirm or refute the aircraft hypothesis is one that has been considered by researchers on both sides of the debate. The proponents of the aircraft hypothesis have identified several types of evidence that, if discovered, would significantly strengthen their case. The discovery of a horizontal tail surface that fits the slot at the base of the Saqqara bird's tail, the discovery of other bird figurines with similar aerodynamic features that constitute a tradition of production rather than an isolated occurrence, the discovery of textual references in Egyptian or Greek sources that describe experiments with flight or with aerodynamic objects, and the discovery of workshop debris, including partially completed bird figurines or prototype designs, that indicates a process of aerodynamic optimization. The critics have identified several types of evidence that, if discovered, would significantly weaken the aircraft hypothesis. The discovery of the Saqqara bird's archaeological context, including the specific funerary goods with which it was associated, that indicates a religious or decorative function. The discovery of multiple similar bird figurines that clearly represent birds rather than aircraft, indicating that the Saqqara bird is a product of a stylistic tradition rather than a technological one, and the detailed materials analysis of the Saqqara bird that reveals that the wing shape and the tail configuration are the result of working or warping rather than of deliberate design. The prospect of discovering any of these types of evidence is uncertain because the archaeological record of the Ptolemaic period at Saqqara is fragmentary, and because the original excavation records are incomplete. The discovery of new evidence would require either the re-examination of existing collections, looking for artifacts that may have been misidentified or overlooked, or new excavations at Saqqara or at other Ptolemaic period sites, which would be expensive and time-consuming, and which would require the cooperation of the Egyptian authorities. The relationship between the Saqqara bird and the broader history of model aircraft provides a perspective that illuminates the debate from a different angle. Model aircraft, in the form of kites, throne gliders, and other small flying devices, have been produced by cultures around the world for thousands of years, and the history of model aviation is far older and far more widespread than the history of full-scale aviation. The Chinese kite, which dates to the 5th century before the Common Era, is the oldest known model aircraft, and it was followed by a wide variety of model flying devices that were produced in China, Japan, India, the Middle East, and Europe over the following millennia. The model glider, which is a heavier-than-air device that flies without power by converting its altitude into forward speed, is a specific type of model aircraft that has a long history, and that is directly relevant to the Saqqara bird debate. The earliest known model gliders were produced in China, where paper gliders were a popular toy and recreational device. for over 1,000 years before they were introduced to Europe. The possibility that the Saqqara bird was an early model glider produced by Egyptian craftsmen who had developed the concept independently or who had been influenced by Chinese kite technology is one that has been considered by researchers who study the history of model aviation. The specific properties that a model glider must possess in order to achieve stable flight, including a stable aerodynamic configuration, an appropriate weight distribution, and a wing shape that produces sufficient lift at the appropriate flight speed, are the same properties that the proponents of the aircraft hypothesis have identified in the Saqqara bird. The correspondence between the properties of a functional model glider and the properties of the Saqqara bird is the foundation of the aircraft hypothesis, and the question of whether this correspondence is the result of deliberate design or of coincidence is the question that has divided researchers for over 50 years. The history of the rediscovery of flight in the modern era provides additional context for evaluating the Saqqara bird. The modern rediscovery of the principles of heavier-than-air flight began with the work of George Cayley in the early 19th century, who identified the four forces that act on an aircraft in flight, lift, weight, thrust and drag, and who built and tested small model gliders that demonstrated the principles of fixed-wing flight. Cayley's model gliders, which were built from lightweight materials, and which were designed according to the principles of aerodynamics that Cayley had identified through his research, are the direct ancestors of the modern aircraft, and they represent the first systematic, scientific approach to the design of flying machines. The comparison between Cayley's model gliders and the Saqqara bird reveals both similarities and differences. Both objects are small, lightweight, wooden or similar devices that are designed, or at least shaped, for flight through the air. Both objects have wings that produce lift, bodies that are streamlined to reduce drag, and tail surfaces that provide stability. The primary difference is that Cayley's gliders were the product of a systematic, scientific approach to the design of flying machines, guided by a theoretical understanding of the principles of aerodynamics, while the Saqqara bird, if it was a model of a flying machine, was the product of an empirical approach that was guided by observation and by practical experimentation rather than by theoretical understanding. The concept of technological imagination, the ability of a culture to conceive of technologies that do not yet exist and to envision the ways in which those technologies might be developed and used, is one that the Saqqara bird illustrates with particular clarity. The ancient Egyptians possessed a rich technological imagination that is demonstrated by the mythological and the artistic traditions that describe and depict objects and capabilities that did not exist in the physical world, but that existed in the cultural imagination. The Egyptian mythological tradition describes gods who fly through the sky, boats that sail through the heavens, and souls that soar above the earth, and these descriptions demonstrate a cultural imagination that was deeply engaged with the concept of flight. The artistic tradition depicts winged deities, winged sun disks, and birds in flight with a precision and a vividness that demonstrate a detailed observational knowledge of the mechanics and the aesthetics of flight. The Saqqara bird, whether it is a bird or a glider, is a product of this rich technological imagination, an object that embodies the cultural fascination with flight that was one of the defining characteristics of Egyptian civilization. The question of whether the technological imagination of the ancient Egyptians extended from the cultural realm to the technological realm, from the mythological concept of flight to the practical concept of a flying machine, is the fundamental question that the Saqqara bird raises. The mythological concept of flight, which is found in virtually every ancient culture, does not, by itself, constitute evidence of the technological concept of a flying machine, because the mythological concept is a supernatural one that does not require any physical mechanism for its realization. The gods fly because they are gods, not because they have wings that produce aerodynamic lift. The souls of the dead fly because they have been transformed by the power of the funerary rituals, not because they have been equipped with aircraft. The transition from the mythological concept of flight to the technological concept of a flying machine is a conceptual leap that requires the recognition that flight is not a supernatural power, but a physical phenomenon that can be produced by specific physical mechanisms. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians made this conceptual leap, and whether the Saqqara bird is evidence of that leap, is one that touches on the deepest questions about the nature of human technological progress and about the relationship between imagination and invention. The broader question of what the Saqqara bird tells us about the role of art in the development of technology is one that has been explored by scholars who study the relationship between aesthetic, form and functional design. The history of technology is full of examples of objects whose aesthetic form was influenced by their functional requirements, from the streamlined shapes of racing cars to the organic curves of aircraft wings. The relationship also runs in the other direction, with objects whose functional design was influenced by aesthetic considerations, from the decorated surfaces of Renaissance firearms to the ornamental metalwork of Art Nouveau architecture. The Saqqara bird, which exists at the boundary between art and technology, between the aesthetic form of a bird and the functional form of an aircraft, illustrates the complex and bidirectional relationship between aesthetic and functional design. The question of whether the Saqqara bird's form was driven by aesthetics or by function, by the desire to create a beautiful object, or by the desire to create a functional one, is one that may not have a simple answer, because the ancient Egyptian concept of beauty was deeply connected to the concept of function. The Egyptian concept of mat, which encompasses both the aesthetic ideal of harmony and balance and the functional ideal of order and correctness, suggests that the ancient Egyptians did not draw the same sharp distinction between aesthetics and function that the modern world typically draws. An object that was beautiful was also correct, and an object that was correct was also beautiful. The Saqqara bird, if it was produced within this conceptual framework, might have been intended to be both beautiful and functional, both a representation of a bird and a model of a flying machine, without the craftsman perceiving any contradiction between these two purposes. The question of what the Saqqara bird would mean for the history of human flight, if it were confirmed as a model of a glider, is one that has been explored by historians of aviation, who have considered the implications of an ancient Egyptian discovery of the principles of heavier-than-air flight. The confirmation of the aircraft hypothesis would require a significant revision of the history of aviation, which currently begins with the work of George Cayley in the early 19th century, and which does not include any ancient or medieval precedents for the concept of fixed-wing flight. The revision would not diminish the achievements of Cayley, Lilienthal, or the Wright brothers, because their contributions were based on a systematic, scientific understanding of aerodynamic principles that was far more advanced than anything that the ancient Egyptians could have possessed. But the revision would demonstrate that the concept of heavier-than-air flight, the idea that an object can be designed to move through the air by exploiting the aerodynamic forces that act on its surfaces, was conceived independently by the ancient Egyptians thousands of years before it was formally articulated by modern science. The demonstration of independent invention would be a significant contribution to the history of ideas, showing that the concept of flight is not a uniquely modern concept, but a universal human concept that has been independently discovered by multiple civilizations at multiple times. The question of why the ancient Egyptian discovery of the principles of flight, if it occurred, was not developed further, is a question that connects the Saqqara bird to the broader themes that we have explored in this series, including the question of why the Eolipile was not developed into a practical steam engine, and why the Antikythera mechanism was not followed by the development of mechanical computing. The answer, as we have seen in other contexts, involves the specific economic, social, intellectual, and material conditions that determine whether a discovery is developed into a technology or whether it remains a curiosity. The ancient Egyptians, like the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, possessed specific discoveries that were not developed into practical technologies. because the conditions for their development were not present. The Saqqara bird, if it is a model of a glider, represents a specific discovery, the discovery of the principles of heavier-than-air flight that was made in a specific context, the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history, and that was not developed into a practical technology, because the conditions for the development of aviation, the availability of lightweight, strong materials, the development of power sources that could produce the thrust needed for sustained flight, and the economic and social demand for air transportation were not present in the ancient world. The failure to develop the discovery was not a failure of imagination or of intellect. It was a failure of conditions, a failure that was shared by every other ancient civilization that approached the boundaries of flight technology without crossing them. The question of what future generations of researchers will make of the Saqqara bird, and whether advances in technology and in knowledge will eventually resolve the debate, is one that provides a note of hope in an otherwise uncertain story. The development of new analytical techniques, new computational methods, and new archaeological approaches is a continuous process, and the tools that will be available to future researchers will be more powerful and more precise than the tools that are available today. The possibility that future researchers equipped with these more powerful tools will be able to resolve the Saqqara bird debate is a realistic one, and the prospect of resolution provides motivation for the continued preservation and the continued study of the artifact. The history of the study of ancient artifacts provides precedents for the resolution of long-standing debates through the development of new analytical techniques. The Antikythera mechanism, which was debated for decades before the development of X-ray computed tomography, allowed researchers to read the inscriptions on the internal gears and to determine the specific function of the device, is the most relevant precedent. The Lycurgus cup, which was not understood until the development of transmission electron microscopy, allowed researchers to observe the nanoparticles that produce its dichroic color, is another. In both cases, the development of a new analytical technique provided the information that was needed to resolve the debate, and the possibility that a similar development will resolve the Saqqara bird debate is one that gives reason for cautious optimism. The specific analytical techniques that are most likely to contribute to the resolution of the Saqqara bird debate include high-resolution computed tomography scanning, which would reveal the internal structure of the artifact and would identify any hidden features or attachment points. Three-dimensional surface scanning, which would produce a precise digital model of the artifact that could be used for computational aerodynamic analysis, and detailed wood analysis, including the identification of the specific tree species and the specific growing conditions of the tree from which the wood was obtained, which might provide information about the geographical origin of the material and about the specific workshop or community that produced the artifact. The application of these techniques to the Saqqara bird would require the cooperation of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which holds the artifact and which has the authority to grant or to deny access to researchers. The development of a cooperative relationship between the international research community and the Egyptian Museum is essential for the advancement of the Saqqara bird research, and the cultivation of this relationship is a priority for the researchers who are most committed to the resolution of the debate. The question of whether the ancient world produced any full-scale flying machines, as opposed to small models or toys, is one that has been explored by historians of technology who have investigated the ancient legends and the ancient texts for evidence of actual flight. The investigation has not produced any credible evidence of full-scale flight in the ancient world, though it has produced a number of intriguing legends and accounts that describe attempts at flight that ended in failure, or that describe flying objects whose nature is unclear. The legend of the Tower of Babel, which describes a structure that was intended to reach the heavens, has been interpreted by some researchers as a metaphor for an attempt at flight that was ultimately unsuccessful. The legend of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun and whose wax wings melted, has been interpreted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of flight that may have been based on actual attempts at flight that ended in failure. The account of the Chinese inventor Yuan Huangtou, who is reported to have been launched from a tower on a kite-like device in the 6th century of the Common Era, is one of the earliest documented accounts of a human flight attempt, though the account is of uncertain reliability. The absence of credible evidence of full-scale flight in the ancient world does not rule out the possibility that small-scale experiments with aerodynamic objects, such as the Saqqara Bird, were conducted. The step from a small model to a full-scale aircraft is an enormous one that requires specific materials, specific power sources, and specific engineering knowledge that were not available in the ancient world. And the failure to develop full-scale flight does not imply the failure to experiment with small-scale aerodynamic objects. The Saqqara Bird, if it was a model glider, represents the kind of small-scale experimentation that might have occurred in the ancient world. Without leaving a trace in the textual or the archaeological record, experimentation that was too modest and too preliminary to attract the attention of the ancient writers, but that was nonetheless a genuine engagement with the principles of flight. The relationship between the Saqqara Bird and the concept of appropriate curiosity in the study of ancient technology is one that deserves final emphasis. The study of ancient technology requires a balance between skepticism and open-mindedness, between the rigorous evaluation of evidence and the willingness to consider possibilities that lie outside the conventional framework. The Saqqara Bird demands this balance because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous and because the stakes of the interpretation are genuinely high. The artifact is neither a proven ancient aircraft nor a definitively identified bird figurine. It is an artifact that sits at the boundary between the known and the unknown, challenging us to investigate with care and to interpret with humility. The Saqqara Bird, in its small and modest way, embodies this ancient tradition of experimentation and aspiration, connecting the world of the Ptolemaic Egyptian craftsman to the world of the modern aeronautical engineer through a shared fascination with the principles that allow objects to move through air. What does the Saqqara Bird mean for our understanding of the relationship between ancient knowledge and modern technology, between observation and invention, and between the human aspiration to fly and the technological achievement of flight? The first implication is a recognition that the boundary between natural and technological forms is not as clear as we typically assume. The Saqqara Bird, whether it is a bird or an aircraft, is an object whose form is determined by the physics of flight, by the specific shapes and proportions that are needed for an object to move through air efficiently and stably. The wings of a bird and the wings of an aircraft are shaped by the same physics, and the similarity between the two shapes is not a coincidence but a consequence of the fundamental laws of aerodynamics that govern the behavior of objects in air. The Saqqara Bird, by existing at the boundary between the natural and the technological, the bird and the aircraft, illustrates the deep connection between the forms that nature produces and the forms that human technology creates. The second implication is a recognition of the power of observation as a source of technological knowledge. The ancient Egyptians, who observed birds in flight for millennia, accumulated a body of empirical knowledge about the shapes, the proportions, and the behaviors that are associated with successful flight. This observational knowledge, which was encoded in the cultural traditions of art, of religion, and of craftsmanship, may have been sufficient to produce objects whose shapes were optimized for aerodynamic performance, even without the formal scientific understanding of aerodynamics that was developed in the modern era. The possibility that the Saqqara Bird represents the application of observational knowledge to the design of an aerodynamic object is consistent with the broader pattern of empirical excellence that we have identified in other ancient technologies, including the corrosion-resistant iron of the Delhi pillar, the nanoparticle glass of the Lycurgus cup, and the self-healing concrete of the Roman builders. There is a pause worth taking here. Consider the ancient Egyptian craftsman who carved the Saqqara Bird, sitting in his workshop, shaping the sycamore wood with his tools, giving form to an object that would survive for 2,000 years, and that would provoke a debate that has lasted for over half a century. What was he thinking? What was he intending? Was he carving a bird, following the conventions of a tradition that had produced thousands of similar objects? Was he carving a model of a flying machine, applying the knowledge that he had gained from years of watching birds and from the accumulated wisdom of his craft tradition? Was he carving something else entirely, a religious symbol, a children's toy, a decorative object whose resemblance to an aircraft is entirely coincidental? We do not know. We cannot know. The craftsman's intention died with him, and the object that he left behind is not enough by itself to recover it. The third implication is a challenge to the linear narrative of technological progress that presents the history of technology as a continuous, cumulative advance from the primitive to the sophisticated. The Saqqara bird, if it is a model of a flying machine, would demonstrate that the concept of flight was present in the ancient world thousands of years before it was formally developed by modern science and engineering. The implication would be that the history of aviation is not a linear progression from ignorance to knowledge, but a complex, discontinuous process in which the concept of flight was discovered, lost, and rediscovered over the course of millennia. The fourth implication concerns the ethics of interpretation in the study of ancient artifacts. The Saqqara bird has been adopted by proponents of alternative history as evidence for the existence of advanced ancient civilizations that possess technologies far beyond what mainstream archaeology acknowledges. The use of the Saqqara bird in support of these claims illustrates the danger of interpreting ambiguous evidence in light of pre-existing beliefs, rather than in light of the available evidence. The responsible interpretation of the Saqqara bird requires the acknowledgement that the evidence is ambiguous, that the aircraft hypothesis is possible but unproven, and that the bird hypothesis is also possible and is supported by the broader context of Egyptian funerary practices. The sensationalization of the Saqqara bird, whether by proponents of alternative history or by the popular media, distorts the evidence and does a disservice to the genuine mystery that the artifact represents. The fifth implication is a reflection on the role of imagination in technological development. The Saqqara bird, whether it is a bird or an aircraft, is a product of the human imagination, a physical embodiment of the human ability to conceive of forms that do not exist in nature and to give those forms physical reality in wood, in stone, in metal, or in any other material. The human imagination is the source of all technological innovation, because every technology begins as a concept in the mind of the inventor before it becomes a physical reality in the workshop. The Saqqara bird, by existing at the boundary between the natural and the imagined, between the bird and the aircraft, illustrates the role of imagination in the creation of new forms and the development of new technologies. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians imagined human flight, and whether the Saqqara bird is a physical expression of that imagination, is a question that connects the artifact to the deepest aspirations of the human spirit. The desire to fly, to rise above the earth, and to move through the sky with the freedom and the grace of a bird is one of the most ancient and most universal of human desires, and the expression of this desire in the Saqqara bird, whether it takes the form of a literal model of a flying machine or of a symbolic representation of the soul's flight to the afterlife, is a testament to the power and the persistence of the human imagination. The sixth implication of the Saqqara bird story concerns the relationship between play and invention. The possibility that the Saqqara bird was a toy, a children's glider, or a novelty object that was thrown into the air for amusement is one that has been considered by researchers who note that many of the most important technologies in human history were first developed in the context of play rather than in the context of serious engineering. The kite, which is the ancestor of the modern aircraft, began as a toy. The wheel, which is one of the most important inventions in human history, may have originated as a potter's toy. The relationship between play and invention is well documented in the history of technology, and the possibility that the Saqqara bird was a playful experiment with aerodynamic forms rather than a serious engineering model is one that is consistent with both the physical evidence and the cultural context. The concept of serious play, the use of playful experimentation to explore the properties of materials and the possibilities of design, is one that is relevant to the Saqqara bird debate. The ancient craftsmen who produced wooden objects for funerary and for recreational purposes were engaged in a form of serious play that allowed them to explore the properties of wood and the possibilities of form in a context that was free from the constraints of practical utility. The Saqqara bird, whether it was intended as a bird or as a glider, was produced in this context of serious play, and the specific form that it took may have been influenced by the craftsman's playful exploration of the relationship between shape and flight, an exploration that could have produced an object that was aerodynamically functional without having been deliberately designed as such. The seventh implication of the Saqqara bird story concerns the relationship between preservation and discovery. The Saqqara bird was recovered in 1898 and was catalogued as a bird figurine. It sat in storage for 70 years before its potential aerodynamic significance was recognized by Khalil Messiha. The 70-year delay between the recovery and the recognition of the artifact's potential significance illustrates the importance of interdisciplinary expertise in the interpretation of ancient artifacts, a theme that we have encountered in other episodes of this series, including the Baghdad Battery, which was identified as a potential electrical device by an archaeologist with engineering training. The delay also illustrates the potential for undiscovered treasures in the storage rooms and the archives of the world's museums, where millions of artifacts are stored that have never been fully studied or fully understood. The Saqqara bird was one of thousands of small wooden objects that were recovered from Egyptian tombs in the 19th century, and that were catalogued according to the conventions of the time, conventions that did not include the systematic evaluation of the aerodynamic properties of the objects. The possibility that other objects of similar significance are sitting in museum storage rooms around the world, unrecognized and unstudied, is one that should motivate the systematic re-examination of museum collections using modern analytical methods and modern interdisciplinary expertise. The eighth implication concerns the relationship between certainty and value in the study of ancient artifacts. The Saqqara bird is an artifact whose function and whose significance are uncertain, and the debate about its interpretation has not produced a definitive conclusion after more than 50 years of research and argument. The uncertainty is frustrating for researchers and for the public, who would prefer a clear answer to the question of whether the ancient Egyptians knew how to design a flying machine. But the uncertainty is also valuable because it motivates continued research, continued analysis, and continued debate, all of which deepen our understanding of the artifact, of the ancient world, and of the broader questions about the history of technology that the artifact raises. The value of the Saqqara bird lies not in its answer, but in its question. The question of whether the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge of aerodynamics is a question that challenges our assumptions about the history of technology, that stimulates new research and new analysis, and that reminds us that the ancient world is not fully known, and that the artifacts it has left behind can still surprise us with their implications and their mysteries. The question is worth asking, regardless of whether the answer turns out to be yes or no, because the asking of the question expands our understanding of what is possible and of what the human mind has achieved over the long course of its history. The ninth implication of the Saqqara bird story concerns the responsibility of the scholarly community to engage with the questions that ancient artifacts raise, even when those questions are difficult, and even when the answers are uncertain. The Saqqara bird has been dismissed by some scholars as a fringe artifact that does not deserve serious attention, and the debate about its interpretation has been marginalized in some academic circles because of its association with alternative history and with sensationalist popular culture. This marginalization is unfortunate because the questions that the Saqqara bird raises about the aerodynamic knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, about the origins of the concept of flight, and about the relationship between observation and invention in the history of technology are legitimate and important questions that deserve rigorous investigation. The scholarly community has a responsibility to engage with these questions honestly and rigorously, without prejudice and without the dismissal of evidence that does not fit conventional narratives. The evidence for the aircraft hypothesis is ambiguous, but it is not negligible, And the dismissal of the hypothesis without serious investigation would be as much of a disservice to scholarship as the uncritical acceptance of the hypothesis without adequate evidence. The responsible approach to the Saqqara bird is the approach that acknowledges the ambiguity of the evidence, that investigates the artifact with the best available analytical tools, and that evaluates the competing hypotheses on their merits rather than on their associations. The broader question of how the scholarly community should engage with artifacts that challenge conventional narratives is one that the Saqqara bird, the Baghdad battery, and other enigmatic artifacts have raised with particular force. The conventional narrative of the history of technology presents the development of specific technologies as the achievement of specific civilizations at specific times, and the discovery of artifacts that challenge this narrative can be unsettling for scholars whose work is based on the conventional framework. The responsible response to this unsettlement is not the dismissal of the challenging artifacts, but the honest investigation of the evidence and the willingness to revise the conventional narrative if the evidence warrants it. The Saqqara bird sits in its glass case in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a small wooden object that weighs less than 40 grams and that measures less than 15 centimeters from nose to tail. It is one of the smallest artifacts in the museum's vast collection, surrounded by the colossal statues, the golden treasures, and the monumental sarcophagi that attract the attention of the millions of visitors who pass through the museum each year. Most visitors do not notice it. Most visitors have never heard of it. It is easy to miss, easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as just another bird figurine in a collection that contains hundreds of them. But the Saqqara bird is not just another bird figurine. It is a question, carved in wood, that has been waiting for over 2,000 years for an answer. The question is simple. What am I? The answer is not. The answer requires knowledge that we do not possess, about the intention of the craftsman who made the object, about the cultural context in which it was produced, about the specific purpose that it was intended to serve. The knowledge is lost, buried in the sand of Saqqara, along with the craftsman and the culture that produced him, and the object itself, for all its eloquence of form, cannot supply the knowledge that is needed to interpret it. The debate about the Saqqara bird will continue, as it has continued for over 50 years, because the evidence is ambiguous and because the questions that the artifact raises are too important and too fascinating to be abandoned. The debate is not merely about a small wooden object from ancient Egypt. It is about the nature of human aspiration, about the origins of the desire to fly, about the relationship between observation and invention, and about the capacity of the ancient world to anticipate discoveries that the modern world regards as its own. The Saqqara bird may be a glider, it may be a bird, it may be a religious symbol, a children's toy, a decorative object, or something else entirely that we have not yet imagined. The answer matters, because the answer would tell us something important about what the ancient Egyptians knew and what they were capable of imagining. But the question matters more, because the question reminds us that the past is not fully known, that the artifacts of the ancient world can still surprise us, and that the human aspiration to fly, to rise above the earth and to move through the sky, is older and deeper than the history of modern technology suggests. The wings of the Saqqara bird are spread, as they have been spread for over 2,000 years, in a gesture that is either the representation of a bird in flight or the configuration of a wing designed to produce lift. The vertical tail fin points upward, either as a stylistic flourish or as a directional stabilizer. The body is streamlined, tapered, shaped by the same physics that shapes the body of every creature and every machine that moves through air. The wood is sycamore, the same wood that the Egyptians used for their boats and their coffins and their furniture, a material that connects the Saqqara bird to the everyday life of the civilization that produced it. The craftsman who carved the Saqqara bird is anonymous. His name is lost, his intentions are lost, his knowledge is lost, but his work survives, a small wooden object that has outlasted the empire that produced it, the religion that gave it meaning, and the language in which the craftsman would have described what he was making and why. The work survives, and the questions that it raises survive with it, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, a testament to the enduring mystery of the ancient world and to the enduring power of a question that cannot be put to rest. The bird, or the glider, or whatever it is, waits in its glass case, wings outstretched, pointing toward a sky it may or may not have been designed to reach. The paradox of the Saqqara bird is that its meaning lies not in what it is but in what it might be. If it is a bird, it is a beautiful example of the Egyptian woodworking tradition, a skillfully carved figurine that embodies the Egyptian fascination with flight and with the divine associations of birds. If it is a glider, it is one of the most extraordinary artifacts in the history of human technology, a physical embodiment of aerodynamic knowledge that predates the modern understanding of flight by over 2 millennia. Either way, the object is significant, either as art or as technology, either as symbol or as science, either as a representation of the natural world or as an anticipation of the technological world that was still 2,000 years in the future. The Saqqara bird does not answer the question that it raises. It poses the question, and it leaves the answer to us, to the researchers who study it, to the engineers who analyze it, to the historians who contextualize it, and to the curious minds who contemplate it. The question is whether the ancient Egyptians knew how to design a flying machine. The answer is, we do not know, we may never know, but the question itself, and the small wooden object that provokes it, will continue to fascinate and to inspire for as long as there are people who look at the sky and wonder whether the ancients looked at it too, with the same longing and the same understanding, and whether they tried, in their own way, with their own materials and their own knowledge, to reach it. The sycamore wood is dry and dark with age, its surface worn smooth by the centuries, its grain faded and compressed by the weight of 2 millennia. The wings extend from the body at the angle that the craftsman chose, whether that angle was chosen for beauty or for lift, for symbolism or for aerodynamics, for the representation of a bird in flight, or for the configuration of a wing designed to carry an object through the air. The vertical tail fin points upward, marking the object as something unusual among the thousands of bird figurines that the Egyptian workshops produced. Something different, something that does not quite fit the category in which it was placed. The object is small enough to hold in one hand. It is light enough to be lifted by a child. It is simple enough to have been carved in a single sitting by a skilled craftsman. And yet it has provoked a debate that has engaged some of the finest minds in Egyptology, in aeronautical engineering, and in the history of technology, a debate that has produced more questions than answers, and that has demonstrated, more clearly than almost any other artifact, the limits of what we can know about the ancient world from the physical evidence that it has left behind. The Saqqara bird is a question mark carved in sycamore wood, a physical embodiment of the uncertainty that characterizes our knowledge of the ancient world. The question that it asks is simple, but the answer is elusive, hidden in the gap between what we can observe and what we can know, between the physical evidence of the artifact and the intention of the craftsman who made it. The wings are outstretched. The body is streamlined. The tail fin points upward. The wood is dark with the passage of 2,000 years. And the question remains, as it has remained since Khalil Messiha first noticed the small wooden object in a storage room in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo in 1969. What is it? A bird? A glider? A symbol of the soul's flight to the afterlife? A model of a flying machine that anticipates the modern aircraft by 2 millennia? The answer, if it ever comes, will come not from the object itself, but from the context that surrounds it, from the tomb in which it was buried, from the culture that produced it, from the intentions of the craftsman who carved it. The object alone cannot answer the question, because the answer is not in the wood, but in the mind that shaped it, a mind that has been silent for 2,000 years. And that speaks to us now only through the ambiguous eloquence of a small wooden form that looks like something that should not have existed in the ancient world. The sycamore wood endures. 2,000 years of Egyptian heat and desert dryness and the cool darkness of a tomb have preserved the wood and its shape, the shape that has provoked so much debate and so much fascination since it was first recognized as something other than a simple bird figurine. The wood is a message from an ancient craftsman, a message that may describe a bird in flight, or that may describe a machine in flight, a message that is written in the language of form rather than in the language of words, a language that is open to multiple interpretations and that may never be definitively decoded. The Saqqara bird is one of the most important artifacts in the history of the study of ancient technology, not because it provides a definitive answer to the question of whether the ancient Egyptians knew how to fly, but because it asks the question in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. The artifact is real, its aerodynamic features are measurable, its resemblance to an aircraft is undeniable, even if it is coincidental, and the question that it raises, the question of whether the ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge of the principles of flight, is a question that the scholarly community has a responsibility to investigate with the full range of analytical tools and intellectual resources that are available. The answer may be yes, the answer may be no, the answer may be something in between, something more nuanced and more complex than either a simple affirmation or a simple denial. The Saqqara bird, like all great mysteries, invites us to think more carefully, to investigate more rigorously, and to resist the temptation of premature certainty. The small wooden object from Saqqara, carved over 2,000 years ago by an unknown craftsman for an unknown purpose, continues to challenge, to fascinate, and to inspire, a testament to the enduring power of a question that has no easy answers and that may never be fully resolved.